Hello there, and welcome to Planet in Question, where curiosity gets cozy and the great questions of time are allowed to breathe. Tonight, we'll wander somewhere far beyond recorded history, beyond even the oldest myths or fossils that we can hold in our hands. Our journey takes us to a world so old that continents were still strangers to their present shapes, and the creatures that would one day rule the planet were only beginning to stir beneath the shadows of reptilian giants. But the question we'll be gently drifting through isn't just about those small fur-covered beginnings. It's about the possibility whispered, impossible, and strangely beautiful that someone was there to see it happen. What if, before humanity, before mammals even began to shape their world, an ancient civilization stood upon the raw surface of a younger Earth and watched it all unfold? Before we sink into that thought, take a moment to notice where you are right now. Maybe it's late at night, and you're curled up under the weight of a blanket, letting the day fade into quiet edges. Maybe you're somewhere in the soft light of morning, the world just beginning to wake, or maybe it's somewhere in between, a still pocket of calm in a noisy day. Wherever you are, you and I are about to travel not through space but through time, to a period when the air itself felt thicker, the skies redder, and the very rhythm of life was still experimenting with what it meant to endure. If you find comfort in these slow journeys, these long meanders through imagination and prehistory, I'd be grateful if you left a like or subscribed. It helps this little corner of calm find others who might need a gentle space to rest and wander too. Now, close your eyes if it feels right to, and imagine an Earth that has just survived its greatest trial. 250 million years ago, the world nearly died. Almost all life vanished, the result of volcanic fury so vast it filled the sky with poison and turned the oceans into silent graves. This was the end of the Permian, sometimes called the Great Dying. And yet, after catastrophe, there was always recovery. In the cracks and the shallows, in the heat and the dark, life began again. The Triassic dawned slowly, like the first light after a storm. The forests of strange trees rose. Reptiles, some small, some unimaginably large, crept and swam and soared, and hidden among them were the first tiny mammals, warm-blooded, furred and fragile. They were the faint beginning of a future they couldn't possibly imagine. But what if they weren't the only ones beginning again? What if the Great Dying hadn't erased everything that could think, build, or remember? What if, in some pocket of the world, perhaps a plateau untouched by ash, or a subterranean refuge untouched by time, something older survived? Not human, not even mammal, but aware. Intelligent enough to watch the world return to life and to understand what it was seeing. We tend to think of civilization as uniquely ours, a product of opposable thumbs, tools and language. But intelligence is not bound to one form. It could have flickered before, then been erased, leaving no trace but the faintest disturbances in the stone. Imagine for a moment what that civilization might have been like. Perhaps it didn't build in the way we do, with towers and cities and roads. Maybe its architecture was softer, woven into the landscape, made of minerals that crumbled long ago or of structures so vast they became part of the terrain itself. Maybe its symbols are still there, written across the fault lines and mountain ranges we mistake for chance. It's easy to think that time erases everything, but sometimes it only buries. Under our feet, the record of the Earth is layered like the pages of a vast and patient book, each chapter pressed beneath the next. Most are rewritten, folded back into the mantle by tectonic drift, but every so often a fragment survives fossils, minerals, patterns that don't belong. If there had been a civilization before ours, could we even know? Stone erodes, metal oxidizes, cities collapse and vanish in a few thousand years. In a million, they are indistinguishable from nature. In 100 million, even the rocks that once held their outlines are reborn. It's humbling to realize how little the Earth remembers us. We are a whisper in deep time, and deep time is vast enough to forget entire ages. And yet, what if somewhere in that immensity, an age existed that remembered watching the first mammals scurry in the shadows of giant reptiles, the first beating of small, warm hearts in a cold-blooded world? The thought alone bends our sense of continuity. Civilization, we believe, began only a few thousand years ago, but life has had billions of years to experiment. We may simply be the latest iteration of awareness, not the first. The first mammals, after all, were not grand creatures. They were small, quiet, cautious, But perhaps, to ancient eyes belonging to beings who had seen the world burn and heal, they represented something astonishing: resilience. A sign that life could endure, adapt, and change form. If such witnesses existed, maybe they didn't see mammals as primitive but as a promise, a gentle seed of something new. Take a breath and imagine standing beside them. The air smells of resin and ash. The ground is warm beneath your feet from the restless churn of volcanoes. In the distance, rivers coil through fern forests, and the cries of strange reptiles echo through the haze. You look closer, and there a tiny creature with fur, with soft eyes and quick darting motions, searching for food among the roots. You can almost feel the awe of that moment, the quiet understanding that something delicate has appeared in a brutal world. The watchers might have known they were seeing the beginning of a new lineage, or perhaps they saw it as we see the stars, distant, beautiful, and indifferent to our gaze. What does it mean to witness the birth of something that will one day replace you? To see intelligence not as an isolated spark, but as a rhythm that comes and goes through the ages. Perhaps the watchers, if they existed, understood that civilizations, like species, rise and fall in waves. Each leaves behind only faint traces, chemical, geological, or mythological, for the next to rediscover. Maybe, in some buried way, our fascination with deep time, with ancient mysteries, with myths of forgotten worlds, is their message echoing through us. It's an unsettling comfort, isn't it? The idea that we're not the first to wonder, that someone, somewhere, looked at the same moon, the same shifting constellations, and thought the same question: who will come after us? Time folds so easily that sometimes it feels like we're answering them now. When we study fossils, or peer through microscopes at the oldest cells, or simply marvel at how long life has survived, we may be continuing a tradition of awe that began long before humans ever existed. So tonight, as we begin this slow drift through the world before mammals, hold this possibility softly in your mind. Not as proof or claim, but as a thought worth exploring, that perhaps Earth has hosted more than one awakening. That civilizations might not be singular events, but recurring dreams of the planet itself, dreams that rise, fade, and rise again. And if that's true, then maybe, somewhere in the geological depths of time, a forgotten people once looked across their recovering world and whispered, with quiet wonder, "Look, something new has begun." And with that whisper, our journey begins. Chapter 1: A Forgotten Dawn. The world is never still. Even when it appears calm, when the wind stops and the horizon softens into haze, the earth beneath our feet is always in motion. Plates drift, heat rises from the mantle, oceans shift their boundaries grain by grain. But there are the moments in its story when the change is not subtle at all, when the planet seems to tear itself apart and begin again. The dawn we're easing into tonight belongs to one of those moments. A time when the world, after nearly ending, began to breathe again. Imagine the Earth roughly 250 million years ago, at the close of the Permian period. The continents are still gathered together into a single massive land called Pangaea, a shape so vast that its center is dry and scorched, while its edges are rimmed with swampy forests. The air is heavy with carbon dioxide, and heat shimmers endlessly across the plains. The Great Dying has only just passed a catastrophe so complete that 9 out of 10 species vanished into silence. Whole forests turned to ash. Coral reefs disappeared from the oceans. Rivers ran black with minerals from poisoned soil. For a while, it seemed that the story of life itself might have ended there. But slowly, through the dust and the heat, the first shoots of green returned, and with them, the fragile beginnings of new life. You can almost picture it. Vast stretches of land under a copper sky, volcanoes still rumbling faintly in the distance, their fumes curling upward into a dim sun. The smell of sulfur in the air. The ground cracked and baked, but within the cracks life. Mosses and early conifers pushing through, small creatures scurrying in the heat, their scales glinting like bronze. This was a world recovering from trauma, learning once again how to live. It was also, perhaps, a world that was being watched. If we let ourselves imagine an ancient civilization existing before this moment, we must also imagine what survival would have meant for them. No cities could have endured the global fires. No fragile monuments could have resisted the relentless floods of lava or the poisoned rain. Yet, If intelligence had evolved before the Permian extinction, it might have persisted underground, deep within stable caverns, or beneath the oceans where the chaos above couldn't reach. Maybe their culture was adapted to endure deep time, slow, patient, capable of waiting. And as the world began to heal, they might have emerged again, blinking into the sunlight of a changed planet. They would have seen a sky filled with red dust. They would have walked among forests of tree ferns and strange needle-leaved ancestors of pines. They would have listened to a new kind of sound, the chirping of insects that had managed to survive, the rustle of lizards darting through leaves. For them, the earth would have felt reborn, the air rich but unfamiliar. Perhaps they built small observatories on the high plateaus of Pangaea, watching the stars return through clearing skies, noting the subtle shifts in the heavens after the long darkness. In their records, if any survived, they might have written about the emergence of warmth, of motion, of a new form of life unlike any they had known. It's hard for us to picture civilizations that far back, because we're so accustomed to thinking of progress as a straight line, simple to complex, primitive to advanced. But in truth, the Earth's history is cyclical, a slow breathing in and out of creation and loss. If there were others before us, their story might have risen and fallen in waves, leaving behind only minerals and myths. The thought isn't proof, of course it's poetry, but sometimes, in the absence of proof, poetry is the only tool we have for approaching the unimaginable. Now, close your eyes for a moment and let yourself wander through that landscape. The ground is warm beneath your feet. In the distance, something moves, a creature shaped like a lizard, but with fur, soft and thin like smoke. It sniffs the air cautiously, its movements sharp and deliberate. Its eyes, large and dark, flicker with something that feels almost familiar. You realize you're looking at one of the first mammals, or something close to it. A small nocturnal survivor from a lineage that will one day lead to us. But right now it's just trying to live eating insects, hiding from predators, listening to the rumble of the world around it. Imagine standing beside the ancient witnesses, whoever or whatever they were, as they observed this small creature. Would they have recognized it as something significant? Would they have seen intelligence waiting to bloom? Or would it have seemed trivial, just another adaptation in a long parade of life's experiments? Perhaps they took note of it the way astronomers note a faint star recording its presence, never guessing that one day it would light up the sky. The air is thick with change. Evolution is restless here. Amphibians are giving way to reptiles, reptiles to early dinosaurs, and in the shadows, these small, warm-blooded beings are quietly testing new ways to live. They nurse their young, they seek warmth in the dark, they rely not on size or speed, but on endurance and adaptation. If the ancient watchers had philosophies, they might have seen in these creatures a reflection of themselves, a sign that intelligence, however it manifests, always begins with the desire to persist. There's a tenderness in imagining that moment, a fragile hope in the midst of devastation. Life, once nearly erased, beginning again. The watchers, whoever they were, might have stood on cliffs overlooking ancient rivers, watching as tiny footprints pressed into wet mud prints that, millions of years later, we would find fossilized in stone. Perhaps they too left marks, small carvings or symbols meant to commemorate survival. Over time, those marks would erode, buried by layers of sediment and folded into mountains. We might walk past them today without ever realizing what we've stepped over. Every civilization that ever was or will be must face the truth that the earth is both cradle and eraser. It nurtures, then forgets. Continents drift, oceans consume, mountains rise and crumble. Even our most enduring monuments are brief compared to the patience of geology. But within that impermanence lies a strange beauty. The watchers may have known this, that to exist, even for a while, is enough. That witnessing the rebirth of life, no matter how small, is itself a kind of immortality. Maybe they recorded their thoughts not in books or machines, but in the rhythm of the land itself, in the alignment of stones, in the geometry of ancient riverbeds, in patterns we now call coincidence. When we study the strata of rock and find sudden shifts in composition, spikes of rare minerals, or magnetic anomalies frozen in crystal, maybe we're reading their script without knowing it. Science calls them records of volcanic events or asteroid impacts. But what if, beneath that, there was intention, a message disguised as nature's memory? The sun sinks low over the Triassic horizon, casting long shadows across the recovering Earth. The world hums quietly with life once more. Somewhere, a small mammal curls into its burrow, its heartbeat steady, its warmth radiating against the cool stone. And somewhere else, perhaps in the depths of a canyon or the hollows of a forgotten plateau, the watchers breathe in unison, aware that they have seen something sacred. They have witnessed life finding its way back. That's where our journey begins, at the edge of silence and renewal, a world scarred but not defeated, a dawn that belongs not to any one species, but to the persistence of life itself. It's humbling to imagine that intelligence might have existed then, not in our image, not with our tools, but with our same quiet awe. They watched, perhaps as we do now, knowing that to observe creation is to be part of it. And so the forgotten dawn gives way to the slow, steady rhythm of survival. The first mammals creep through the underbrush, the watchers vanish into myth, and the Earth, ever patient, turns its face toward another age, carrying with it all the echoes of what has been and the faint heartbeat of what's still to come. Chapter 2. The Edge of Recovery. There are moments in Earth's story when life feels like it's holding its breath, balanced between ending and beginning, between silence and song. The edge of recovery is one of those moments, the fragile interval after destruction when the world tries to remember how to live again. If you could stand on the surface of Earth in that time, just after the Great Dying, you would feel it in the air itself, the hesitance of a planet waking up from a nightmare. The ground would still be scarred from fire, the rivers would still run dark with minerals leached from burned soil, but amid the desolation, there would be movement, tiny, cautious, persistent, shoots of green pushing through ash, insects stirring, the slow, steady pulse of life returning to the places it once knew. If there were watchers, then an ancient civilization that had somehow endured, they would have witnessed the first tentative steps of recovery like witnesses to a miracle. To live through apocalypse is to understand fragility. To watch the world heal afterward is to understand reverence. Perhaps their language didn't even have a word for hope until that moment. They might have stood on cliffs that overlooked blackened plains, feeling the wind carry traces of new pollen, hearing the distant trickle of water cutting through fresh gullies carved by rain. It would have been quiet in a way we can barely imagine. Not the silence of peace, but the silence after chaos. The kind of quiet that comes when everything has been reset, and the world is waiting to see what happens next. The Earth was different then, its air heavy with volcanic gases, its sunlight dimmed by the dust of eruptions that had lasted for millennia. Yet slowly, carbon dioxide began to feed the return of green. Where ferns and conifers took root, the atmosphere shifted. Oxygen crept back. The balance between death and renewal began to tilt. And somewhere in those early forests, creatures began to test new ways of living. They dug into the earth, climbed over roots, and whispered through the undergrowth of a planet relearning its rhythm. Among these survivors were the ancestors of mammals, small, furtive creatures with whiskers and warmth. They were not yet like the mammals we know, but they carried the seed of what would become us. Their bones tell us they nursed their young, that they hunted at night, that they kept their bodies warm through the cold. It's strange to think that such fragile things could outlast the giants that ruled their world. Yet perhaps fragility was their strength. They needed little. They could hide, adapt, endure. Life at the edge of recovery doesn't reward power, it rewards patience. If ancient beings truly watched these creatures, they would have seen a lesson written in fur and heartbeat. The old world had been ruled by dominance, by immense reptiles that conquered every landscape, but dominance had failed. The Great Dying had shown that nothing, no matter how vast, could escape change. The new world belonged to the quiet, the small, the adaptable. The watchers might have realized then that survival was not about strength but resilience, the ability to begin again, no matter how many times the world ends. You can imagine their cities, if they had them, standing half buried in dust, their edges worn by centuries of heat and ash. They might have rebuilt only what was necessary, small refuges carved into cliffs, laboratories of observation rather than monuments of power. Maybe they no longer sought to control nature but to listen to it, to watch it unfold in its strange cyclical way. Perhaps their records were not written on stone or metal but encoded in patterns we have yet to recognize, in magnetic fields, in crystal alignments, in arrangements of matter that to us seem random but to them carried meaning. The edge of recovery is not only physical, it's emotional too. To live after a world that has ended is to live with memory as both a burden and a guide. If these ancient beings existed, they might have carried the grief of extinction within them, but also the wonder of witnessing life's refusal to stop. They would have seen small amphibians crawling back into the rivers, insects returning to lay eggs in the new soil, birds, if any had survived, stretching their wings across unfamiliar skies. The first mammals, shy and soft, would have been emblems of that endurance. Picture one of them now, a creature no larger than your hand, darting between the roots of a fern. Its breath steams faintly in the cool evening air. Above it, the sky glows red from the lingering haze of volcanic dust. The scent of resin and damp soil mingles with the metallic tang of minerals newly exposed by rain. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the slow rhythm of the planet stabilizing the drip of water, the whisper of wind through young forests, the hum of insects tuning the silence. Everything is tentative, as if the earth itself fears waking too quickly, afraid it might fall back into the chaos it just escaped. For us, looking back from the far end of time, it's easy to see this moment as a transition, a mere step toward the age of dinosaurs or mammals, or eventually us. But if you imagine standing there, surrounded by that trembling newness, it wouldn't feel like a step. It would feel like a world. Complete, self-contained, alive with possibility. The watchers, if they lived then, might have felt the same. They might have realized that every age, no matter how small or temporary, believes itself to be the full story. Only time knows otherwise. There's a tenderness to that realization. The earth is not cruel when it forgets, it simply moves on. Every recovery rewrites what came before. The mountains shift, seas expand, and whatever traces of the old are left behind become the foundation of the new. It's possible that even now, buried beneath layers of rock, the remnants of that ancient recovery still exist. Fossils of creatures that never quite made it, seeds of plants that germinated once and never again, maybe even artifacts of watchers who vanished long before the world learned to remember. When you think about it this way, the line between imagination and memory begins to blur. We like to think of the past as something we uncover, but perhaps the past is also something we inherit. A set of instincts, fears, and fascinations passed down through countless generations. Our curiosity about ancient times might itself be a kind of ancestral memory. Maybe, deep within our collective consciousness, we still carry the awe of those who stood on the edge of recovery, watching the earth take its first cautious breaths again. The wind of that age would have carried strange scents, volcanic gas, sap, ozone after storms. The light would have been dimmer, filtered through ash and dust, but warm enough for new forests to grow. And at night, the stars would have appeared faint at first, then slowly brighter as the atmosphere cleared. Perhaps those ancient beings, if they existed, looked up at those stars and wondered if life elsewhere followed the same rhythm: destruction, renewal, evolution, memory. They might have known, even then, that intelligence is never permanent but always returning, cycling like seasons across cosmic time. As the earth continued to heal, the forests thickened, rivers carved deeper channels, and the small mammals began to thrive in their quiet corners. The watchers, if they endured, would have watched their own reflection in these creatures: the will to live, the need to adapt, the longing to understand. They might have realized that intelligence itself is not an achievement but an echo, a response to crisis, a flame lit in the dark between one extinction and the next. The edge of recovery, then, is not just a point in history. It's a pattern, one that repeats through ages, one that might even define the rhythm of life on every world that breathes. The watchers might have known that. Perhaps they even knew that one day, far in the future, another species would stand where they once stood, look back through layers of time, and wonder whether someone had once been there watching them too. And so the earth continued its long, patient healing. The skies cleared, the air warmed, life took deeper root. The mammals grew bolder, and the watchers, if they still lingered, grew quieter. They had seen enough to understand that survival is its own kind of wisdom. They didn't need to leave monuments. The earth itself was their record. Every fossil, every ripple of stone, every silent adaptation carried their signature. And in that way, even if they vanished, they were never truly gone. That is the nature of recovery, not a return to what was, but the creation of something entirely new. The watchers understood that. the mammals lived it, and the earth, as always, turned quietly beneath them, writing another chapter in its endless book of beginnings. Chapter 3: Civilization Among Ruins of Time. When the earth begins again, it does not do so all at once. It happens in layers, slowly, quietly, like memory surfacing through fog. The world that rose from the great dying was not the same one that had existed before it. The air was denser, the oceans shallower, and the land carried the scent of minerals freshly exposed by the fires of the past. Life was reshaping itself, tentatively at first, then with gathering confidence. And if there were a civilization that had endured, hidden somewhere through that long night of extinction, it would have emerged into a planet that felt both alien and familiar. A place, half-forgotten, half-remembered civilization among the ruins of time. Imagine them stepping out after millennia of darkness. The horizon would have been strange, the constellations above subtly altered by the slow drift of the continents. The stars would seem to have moved, as if time itself had rearranged the sky. Forests of new forms rose where deserts had been. Rivers carved new paths through the crust. Everything that had once been familiar to them, mountains, oceans, seasons, had changed. They might have looked upon this altered world with reverence and sorrow, recognizing how little of their old life remained. To survive such a catastrophe, their civilization would have had to abandon excess. They would have learned to live beneath the ground, in stone vaults and caverns, where the air was stable and the earth itself shielded them from the chaos above. Over generations, their cities might have become more like ecosystems, self-contained worlds lit by crystal luminescence, powered by heat from the mantle, or chemical reactions drawn from the rocks themselves. Imagine a people who did not see stone as barrier but as home, who had shaped the earth to cradle them. Emerging from such depths into a new age of life would have been like stepping onto a different planet. The first thing they would have noticed, perhaps, was the silence, the absence of the familiar. No calls of the old creatures they once knew, no shapes in the sky they recognized. The earth had started over, and yet, amid the strangeness, there would have been beauty. The air, though heavy, carried the scent of renewal. The forests were young and green, their leaves glistening with oils and sap unknown to the past. The ground, still warm from volcanic heartbeats, radiated life. For them, rebuilding would not have meant reclaiming what they had lost, but learning to live in harmony with what had changed. Perhaps they no longer sought permanence. The memory of extinction would have taught them that permanence is an illusion. Instead, they might have built in ways that could vanish easily. Structures of organic material, delicate and temporary, meant to return to the soil without trace. Their civilization might have looked almost invisible to us. Woven, cities that grew and decayed with the seasons, knowledge stored in patterns of sound or light rather than in written symbols. We imagine ancient civilizations through stone, because that is what endures. But what if true wisdom lies in what does not? A people who lived in deep time, aware of how easily the planet forgets, might have chosen to build in forms that changed as naturally as the tides. They may have left no monuments because they understood that the earth itself was their monument. To them, survival and surrender were not opposites but parts of the same truth, that all things return to the cycle eventually. Still, even a civilization that values impermanence would have kept some record, some echo of what it had been. Perhaps not in language as we know it, but in geometry, in the alignment of forms. Certain mountain ranges today form curious patterns, as though shaped not entirely by chance. Long ridges trace lines that match astronomical angles, as if the land itself remembers a map. We call it coincidence, but maybe it's memory written in stone. The earth is an artist that paints slowly, and maybe once it collaborated with others who shared its patience. As life around them recovered, these survivors would have watched the first mammals creep through the underbrush, fragile and small but filled with promise. To beings that had lived through the collapse of everything, these little warm-blooded creatures might have seemed sacred symbols of persistence. Maybe they studied them, perhaps even protected them, seeing in them the beginnings of a new story. The mammals' quiet cunning, their adaptability, their warmth, they would have felt like the continuation of a principle the watchers already understood. Life's refusal to yield. You can almost see it. A figure standing at the mouth of a cavern, cloaked in mineral dust, watching as a small creature sniffs the air beneath a fern. The sun slants through the haze, golden and strange. For a brief moment, the watcher feels something almost human recognition, empathy, maybe even pride. They know that this small being will inherit a world their own kind no longer can. They turn away, content to let the next age begin. Their civilization, though quiet, might have reached a depth of knowledge we can only guess at. They would have understood geology not as science but as memory, reading the layers of the earth as we read books. They might have measured time not in years but in the slow pulsing of tectonic cycles. Their mathematics could have been built from patterns of erosion, their philosophy from the rhythm of renewal and decay. For them, to live among ruins was not a tragedy, it was a way of understanding. Everything that is beautiful, they might have believed, owes its beauty to impermanence. If they had language at all, perhaps it was sung rather than spoken, shaped to resonate within stone chambers. Those songs could have echoed through the tunnels for centuries after their voices were gone, blending into the low hum of the planet itself. Even now, when we hear the wind moan through caves or the deep vibration of an earthquake, maybe it's not only the movement of rock we're hearing, but the fading tones of something that once sang beneath it. As time went on, their numbers would have dwindled. Some may have ventured back into the open, settling along the edges of new forests and lakes, adapting once again to light and weather. Others might have chosen to remain below, merging gradually with the subterranean ecosystems, their bodies adapting to the darkness until they became something other than what they had been. Eventually, both branches, surface and underground, would vanish into the vast anonymity of evolution, leaving only faint traces behind. Perhaps the mammals, in their own slow rise, inherited fragments of their endurance. And yet, their presence lingers in the imagination, doesn't it? When we speak of lost civilizations, when we tell stories of Atlantis, Agartha, or forgotten worlds beneath the ground, perhaps we are remembering them unconsciously. The myths might not be inventions, but echoes a kind of collective dream passed down from a time before time. It's as though the earth itself remembers, whispering through human minds stories of those who came before. Standing now in our own age, surrounded by our own ruins in the making, we can almost feel their gaze on us. Maybe they watched the first mammals the way we now study the stars, aware that something new was beginning, something beyond them, something they could not stop. And perhaps, in that moment, they felt a calm acceptance. To be the witness rather than the actor, the observer rather than the ruler that might have been their final lesson. The ruins of their world would not have looked like ours. No towers, no steel, no glass. Just the subtle imprints of symmetry and rock, traces of geometry that we mistake for chance. Theirs was a civilization that understood humility before time. They did not seek to conquer the earth, only to belong to it completely. And in that quiet belonging, they achieved what we still struggle to piece with impermanence. As night fell on that recovering planet, the stars would have shone faintly through the lingering haze. The watchers might have looked up one last time, their eyes reflecting the light of constellations that no longer exist. Around them, the first mammals rustled through the underbrush, unaware of the enormity of their inheritance. Civilization among the ruins of time gave way to instinct, to heartbeat, to the steady continuation of life's story. And the earth, indifferent but generous, turned once more toward its next dawn. Perhaps that is the deepest truth of all, that no civilization truly ends. It becomes part of what follows. The watchers became the soil fed the forests sheltered the mammals, and the mammals, after uncounted ages, became us creatures who look back at the earth and wonder who watched before we did. Chapter 4: Landscapes of Fire and Fern. The Triassic Earth was a place of contradictions. It was both ancient and newborn, scarred yet healing, quiet but full of hidden energy waiting to erupt. To step into that world, even in imagination, is to feel the pulse of a planet rebuilding itself from near ruin. The air would be warmer than ours, and heavier too, dense with gases left behind by millennia of volcanic breath. Every horizon shimmered faintly with heat. The land was alive in a way that felt almost restless, as if the earth hadn't yet settled into the skin it wore. Rivers of molten rock still cut their way across the continents, and steam rose constantly from cracks in the ground. But above these fiery veins, the first great forests of the new age had begun to grow, lush and green and full of promise. To the watchers, if any still existed, this was the world reborn, a landscape caught between flame and fern. Imagine standing on a high plateau overlooking what would one day be the heart of a continent. Below, you would see a sea of green, Not the familiar trees of our modern world, but giant cycads, towering horsetails, and ferns the size of small houses. The air would shimmer with pollen, and the sun filtered through volcanic haze would paint everything in amber light. Beyond the forest, mountains would smoulder, their sides streaked with red and black, the wounds of ancient eruptions still glowing faintly in the dusk. This was the Earth's second chance. It had burned, drowned, and choked on its own gases, but now it breathed again. The scars of extinction hadn't vanished. They were etched into every ridge and plain, but they no longer ruled the world. Life, with its quiet stubbornness, was retaking the stage. And somewhere among those steaming jungles and rocky wastelands, the first mammals crept through the shadows, silent inheritors of a story they didn't yet know they belonged to. If the Watchers had survived into this era, this would have been their canvas. Their civilization, shaped by survival, would have understood the planet's volatility better than we ever could. They might have lived with the rhythms of fire and fern, not resisting them but adapting to their pattern. They would have known that the ground beneath them could shift at any time, that what flourished one season might vanish the next. To them, permanence would have been an illusion, and every structure, every moment of beauty, would have been built with acceptance of impermanence in mind. It's strange to think of civilization without stone cities or tools of metal, but perhaps the Watchers used what the Earth offered: mineral-rich clays that hardened in heat, volcanic glass sharp enough to carve, resins from the forests that could bind and preserve. They may have built small sanctuaries in the shadows of volcanoes, not fearing the fire but worshipping it as the planet's heartbeat. Their art, if they had any, might have been woven into the living landscape: patterns of ferns arranged to catch the wind, or terraces carved into the ash to guide rain into rivers. Over time, these works would have disappeared completely, recycled by the soil, leaving behind only the faintest echoes in the rock. We might not even recognize their ruins if we stumbled upon them today. After hundreds of millions of years, their architecture would have become indistinguishable from geology. A perfectly straight line in a cliff, a series of symmetrical hollows in volcanic stone. Such things might catch the eye of a geologist for a moment, before being dismissed as natural formation. The Earth hides its histories well, and yet, sometimes, standing in a desert where layers of red stone rise like cathedral walls, one can't help but wonder if the symmetry we see there is entirely accidental. In those landscapes of fire and fern, the climate would have swung wildly between extremes. Long, searing summers were followed by brief, torrential rains that turned dry valleys into sudden rivers. Thunderstorms would have rolled across the horizon with the violence of creation itself. Lightning split the sky, striking forests and setting them ablaze. But from the ashes, new growth would rise almost immediately, ferns unfurling, seeds bursting, green reclaiming the blackened ground. Fire and life danced together, destruction and renewal locked in their eternal rhythm. The Watchers, if they stood upon those burning hills, might have seen this pattern not as chaos but as music. To them, perhaps every eruption, every storm, every regrowth was part of the Earth's pulse, a grand symphony of transformation. They would have understood what we often forget, that catastrophe and creation are not opposites but partners. The volcano destroys, yes, but it also fertilizes. The ash that falls upon a dead forest feeds the next. Life thrives not in spite of change but because of it. Imagine them gathering on the edge of a lava plain as night descends. The molten rivers below glow like veins of molten gold. The air hums with heat. In the distance, the first stars blink through the haze, faint but persistent. Around them, the forest rustles with unseen creatures, the hiss of reptiles, the flutter of giant insects, the faint scurry of a mammal in the undergrowth. One of the Watchers kneels, pressing a hand to the warm earth. To them, the planet itself is alive, breathing through the vents and fissures, dreaming in fire. Perhaps they do not pray to gods but to the Earth's own patience. If these beings existed, they would have learned to read the landscape the way we read words. The tilt of a mountain range, the shimmer of minerals in stone, the direction of wind through fern fronds, all would have carried meaning. Theirs would have been a philosophy of observation. They would have known that the universe speaks softly, not in sentences but in cycles. Maybe they recorded their understanding not with symbols but with arrangement, placing stones to trace the movement of stars, planting ferns to map the pattern of prevailing winds. To modern eyes, it would look like randomness. To them, it was scripture. And what of the mammals they might have seen in those forests? Small, vulnerable, nocturnal creatures whose warm bodies defied the cooling nights. They would have recognized something familiar in them: persistence, curiosity, adaptability. Perhaps they watched these animals with a mixture of wonder and melancholy, knowing that they were witnessing the beginning of a lineage that would one day surpass them. Every civilization, no matter how wise, must eventually give way to the next rhythm of life. The watchers might have understood this more deeply than we ever will, that to step aside is as sacred as to endure. The sound of rain would have been constant in that age, soft at first, then pounding, filling the lowlands with steaming pools. The ferns would bend under the weight of water, their leaves trembling. Steam would rise from the heated ground, carrying with it the scent of minerals and wet soil. Lightning would flash again, illuminating the silhouettes of ancient trees, their forms almost architectural in their symmetry. For the watchers, this might have been a nightly ritual, to stand under the rain and feel the cleansing of the world, to remember that they lived within a planet that was still learning itself. Perhaps, in time, they began to vanish into the forests they revered, their homes overgrown, their language absorbed into the rustle of leaves and the crackle of distant fires. The earth doesn't need to destroy to erase it, simply waits. Time, with its infinite patience, turns civilizations into soil. But maybe that was always their intention. Maybe they wanted to become part of the cycle they studied, to dissolve into the same processes they once observed. In that sense, they never truly died. They were reborn into self. The roots of the ferns, in the patterns of basalt, in the small mammals that scurried through the night. If we listen closely to the wind in certain places, ancient valleys, deep forests, volcanic cliffs, we might still hear their echoes. Not words exactly, but tones, vibrations, the faint resonance of something that once understood the world differently. Every now and then, when we look at the shape of a mountain or the spiral of a fern, a strange familiarity stirs in us, as if we're remembering something we never lived. Maybe that's how the earth passes on memory, not through fossils or ruins, but through recognition. And so the landscapes of fire and fern faded into deep time, the forests thickened, the fires cooled. The watchers disappeared into the same soil that nurtured the future. And in their absence, life continued its endless improvisation, each era building on the ruins of the one before, each creature carrying, unknowingly, the echo of all that came before it. The earth does not mourn its changes, it simply keeps moving. And perhaps, if those ancient beings could see us now, they would recognize in our curiosity, our fear, our longing to understand, the same spark that once flickered in their own eyes when they looked across a burning forest and whispered, "Let it begin again." Chapter 5. The First Mammals. The night of the Triassic world was not silent. Beneath the chorus of insects and the low rumble of distant volcanoes, a softer sound stirred the faint rustle of something small, something cautious. The forests that had grown in the shadow of extinction were alive again, but not with giants. Those would come later. For now, the world belonged to the survivors, to creatures that scurried and darted, that hid beneath leaves and ferns, that lived on the edges of the great reptiles' domain. They were the first mammals, quiet inheritors of the Earth's resilience. If you could kneel in that prehistoric night and part the damp leaves with your hands, you might see one of them. A small, shrew-like creature, barely larger than your palm, its fur glistening faintly with dew. It moves quickly, nervous but deliberate, its whiskers twitching, its eyes alert to every sound. Its body radiates warmth, a new kind of warmth for the planet. For the first time in Earth's long story, blood runs hot. These early mammals were not just survivors of catastrophe, they were experiments in a new way of being alive. They came from ancestors that were neither fully reptile nor quite mammal, creatures that had lived in the margins of time for millions of years. These transitional beings, sometimes called synapsids, had already begun to change long before the Great Dying. When the extinction came, it didn't invent mammals overnight. It simply gave their lineage space to grow. With the dominant species wiped away, the small and the adaptable found room to thrive. The first mammals were born not from triumph, but from absence. They were the children of vacancy, filling the gaps that extinction had left behind. Imagine the world as they knew it. By day, the forests belonged to reptiles. Massive herbivores with thick skin and slow tempers trampled through fern fields, their tails sweeping arcs through the undergrowth. Predators, sleek and reptilian, stalked the open plains, their bodies built for heat and sunlight. But when the sun dipped low and the air cooled, the balance shifted. The reptiles, sluggish and cold-blooded, sought warmth in burrows and hollows. The mammals came out to play. Night was their kingdom, a realm of whispers and shadows where warmth was power. They lived small lives but vital ones. They ate insects, roots, eggs, whatever the darkness offered. They were clever, cautious, endlessly adaptable. Their senses sharpened in the dim light, hearing keen enough to catch the flutter of wings, noses sensitive to the faintest scent of food or danger. Their minds, though tiny, held the first glimmers of the processes, intelligence that would one day define an entire branch of life. To the ancient watchers, if they still lingered somewhere in the world, these little beings must have seemed miraculous. They were not large, nor impressive, nor loud, but they embodied something extraordinary continuity. Picture one of the watchers, standing at the edge of a clearing, cloaked in darkness, observing as a small mammal scurries through fallen leaves. The watcher knows what the world has endured, has seen its fires and floods, its destruction and rebirth. To witness this tiny creature, alive and alert, must have felt like seeing the first spark of a candle after endless night. Perhaps they recognized in the mammal's soft persistence the same resilience that had carried their own civilization through disaster. The mammal's warmth was more than a biological curiosity. It was a statement. Warm-blooded life burns brighter but faster. It must feed constantly, move constantly, think constantly. These early mammals were always in motion, their hearts racing, their metabolism a relentless engine. To stay warm, they had to learn efficiency, how to forage, how to shelter, how to care for their young. They couldn't afford the slow indifference of reptiles. Every moment mattered. That urgency, that ceaseless adaptation, would become the hallmark of their descendants. We often imagine evolution as a ladder, each step leading neatly to the next, but it's more like a branching tree. In those Triassic forests, countless forms existed that would never survive beyond a few million years. Some had long snouts and flexible spines. Others had teeth that hinted at omnivory. They were experiments, nature's tentative sketches. The first mammals were not perfect creatures but prototypes, testing what worked and discarding what didn't. Their success wasn't guaranteed. It was earned through endless trial. The nights of that age would have glowed faintly with volcanic light. Ash drifted through, the air like snow, and the ground was warm beneath the ferns. Streams murmured softly, carrying minerals from the mountains into the lowlands. Every breath of wind carried the scent of growth and decay in equal measure. In that strange, steaming twilight, the mammals thrived unseen. They didn't dominate, they endured. They didn't conquer, they adapted. For millions of years, they would remain hidden in the corners of ecosystems ruled by giants. But evolution favors the patient, and the patient have time. It's humbling to think that everything we are, our intelligence, our emotions, our ability to dream began with these small, trembling creatures in the dark. They lived by instinct, not imagination, yet they carried the seeds of both. The warmth that kept them alive would one day fuel thought, art, curiosity, and love. Each heartbeat in the undergrowth was a step toward consciousness. The watchers, if they saw this, might have understood it. Maybe they even foresaw what it meant, that the world was once again preparing to think. Some of these mammals may have lived close to the watchers' hidden dwellings, unaware of the ancient eyes upon them. Perhaps the watchers occasionally left offerings of food or shelter, a quiet experiment in coexistence, or maybe they simply observed, unwilling to interfere, reverent before the unfolding of life's next chapter. To have endured long enough to witness another lineage rise would have been both blessing and sorrow. They must have known that they were fading, that the torch had passed. Over millions of years, those first mammals would diversify. Some would take to the trees, developing grasping claws and longer limbs. Others would burrow deeper into the earth, safe from predators and storms. A few, bold and restless, would explore the edges of rivers and lakes, discovering new ways to feed and move. Each adaptation brought them closer to the forms we know today. They were sculptors of themselves, guided not by will, but by survival. And yet, Even as they evolved, they remained bound to the memory of that first night, the night when warmth became destiny. Every mammal since, from the smallest mouse to the largest whale, carries within it that same ancient spark. The heartbeat that hums in your chest tonight is the echo of theirs. It is the same rhythm that pulsed beneath Triassic stars, when the world was new and fragile and full of potential. For the watchers, if they survived long enough to see this transformation unfold, it must have confirmed what they already suspected, that life cannot be extinguished, only transformed. Perhaps they saw the mammals not as successors, but as continuations, as new verses in a poem that began before memory. Maybe they left no warning, no trace, because they trusted the rhythm to continue without them. In the end, that may be the highest form of wisdom to create conditions for the future. Then step aside. The first mammals did not know they were inheriting a world. They did not know they were destined to outlast empires of scales and bone. They simply lived, night after night, following the quiet laws of survival. And in doing so, they wrote the next chapter of the Earth's story one heartbeat at a time. Their world was smaller than ours, but no less vivid. Every rustle of leaves, every drop of rain, every spark of warmth in the cool air was a declaration that life, even in its smallest form, will always find a way. If the Earth itself could speak, perhaps it would tell us that the mammal's rise was not planned nor inevitable. It was simply what happens when persistence meets opportunity. Out of fire came fur, out of silence came breath, and out of the darkness came the promise of thought. In those trembling bodies hiding under fern leaves, the planet was already dreaming of us, and perhaps, in some deep and ancient sense, it still is. Chapter 6. The Observers. There is something deeply human about the act of watching. Long before we built telescopes or satellites, long before we mapped the stars or measured the seas, we watched. We looked outward and inward, drawn to the quiet mystery of simply seeing. But what if this impulse to observe, to study, to bear witness, is older than humanity itself? What if, in the deep prehistory of our planet, others watched before us? Others who stood under the same skies, gazing at the same constellations before they had names, their eyes reflecting the same curiosity we now call our own. If the watchers survived into the age of the first mammals, this would have been their purpose. They were no longer builders of empires or architects of permanence. They had become students of the earth, keepers of memory, in a world that had forgotten them. Imagine them hidden within the folds of the landscape, quiet and patient, watching as new life crept through the underbrush. Their faces, perhaps worn and unrecognizable to us now, turned toward the movement of tiny furred creatures scurrying under fern shadows. To these ancient observers, the world was not merely alive, it was awakening again. In this slow dawn, their civilization would have changed beyond recognition. They might not have used language as we do, or perhaps they spoke only rarely, communicating instead through gestures, through touch, through rhythm. Words may have seemed too crude a tool for the things they tried to understand. Observation had become their art, their philosophy, even their religion. To them, to see was sacred. The simple act of witnessing was a form of participation in the universe's unfolding. Their days would begin with quiet rituals, greetings to the rising sun, acknowledgement of the wind, the scent of damp earth after rain. They may have lived in harmony with the rhythms of geology itself, their settlements small and temporary, shifting as the land shifted. Perhaps they lived in networks of caves or carved dwellings hidden beneath ridges, always near the warmth of volcanic vents or the safety of forests that could feed them. Their lives were intertwined with the pulse of the earth. They did not seek to control it, only to understand it. It's easy to think of watching as passive, but for them, it was anything but. To observe the world deeply is to feel its changes within yourself. When the seasons shifted, they changed with them. When the earth trembled, their hearts did too. They might have developed an empathy so profound it blurred the line between observer and observed. They were part of the living system they studied, and in that connection, they found meaning. On the nights when the haze cleared, they would gather to study the stars. Imagine them standing in open clearings, their bodies still as the wind stirred their garments of woven reeds and fibre. The constellations above them would not have been the same ones we see now. The continents were arranged differently, and the sky itself tilted slightly in its eternal drift, but the feeling would have been identical to ours. Wonder, a quiet ache for understanding. They might have believed the stars were memories of previous worlds, lights left burning by civilizations that had come and gone across the galaxy. And perhaps they wondered whether those distant watchers looked back at them in turn. It's possible they kept records, though not in the way we think of records. Maybe their archives were made of sound low harmonic tones that could be heard only in the depths of caves, vibrations that carried data through resonance. Or perhaps they stored knowledge in geometry, carving patterns into stone that mirrored the shapes of natural phenomena. River deltas, lightning bolts, the branching of trees. They may have understood that the universe speaks in repetition. What happens in the shape of a leaf also happens in the shape of a galaxy. When they looked upon the mammals, these small warm creatures that crept beneath the canopy, they might have recognized something. Extraordinary, the stirrings of awareness. Not in the way we think of intelligence, but as potential. The mammals were alert, curious, able to learn and adapt with uncanny speed. To the watchers, they must have seemed like sparks waiting to ignite. Maybe they saw in them what they once had been, and maybe, deep down, they knew that their own time was ending, that a new form of mind was preparing to inherit the earth. There's a kind of beauty in that realization, to watch another being rise from the dust of extinction, to see the echo of your own struggle mirrored in their small, bright eyes. The watchers would not have feared replacement, they would have understood it as continuity. Every civilization is part of a chain, each linked to the next, not by dominance, but by the quiet handover of existence. They had watched the world fall apart and return to life. They knew better than to cling to permanence. The mammals' emergence was not an ending, but an answer. As time passed, the watchers themselves would have become myth. Their numbers dwindled, their culture simplified. Their wisdom, so vast and patient, began to fade from memory, surviving only in ritual and song. Perhaps they left symbols carved into stone, not to be found by us, but to remind themselves of what they had seen. Simple shapes, circles within circles, spirals of connection, lines that pointed to the rising sun. The language of the observer is never loud, it whispers through patterns. In our own time, when archaeologists find inexplicable markings in ancient rock lines that align with solstices, spirals cut deep into cliff faces, they often assume they are the work of early humans or natural formations. But what if some of those are remnants of a much older hand? What if the Watcher's language is still all around us, hiding in plain sight? Perhaps the geometry of our own monuments, from standing stones to pyramids, is not an invention but a remembering. Somewhere deep in our species, the collective mind, the instinct to observe and record never faded, it evolved. Imagine a night near the end of their age. The world is changing again. Forests are thick with new species, and the sky is darker now, the haze of the old volcanoes finally gone. The air is rich with oxygen, filled with the scent of living things. The watchers, older and fewer, gather one last time in a clearing surrounded by ferns. Above them, the stars blaze brighter than ever before. One of them raises a hand, tracing patterns in the sky, connecting the points of light into constellations no one will name for hundreds of millions of years. They do not speak, because words would break the silence that the moment deserves. They only watch, and in their watching, they give meaning to all that will follow. Eventually, they will disappear. Their dwellings will crumble, their songs will fade into the hum of wind through caves. But the act of observing will remain. The mammals, small and trembling in the dark, will carry it forward unknowingly. Their eyes, bright with reflection, will one day evolve into ours. The impulse to study the stars, to record the movement of tides, to ask why things are the way they are, that is their inheritance. We are not the first to wonder, only the latest. The Watcher's final gift, perhaps, was understanding that to see something truly is to love it. Their legacy was not technology or architecture, but perception, the deep attention that transforms observation into reverence. When we look at the night sky, we are continuing their ritual. When we marvel at the persistence of life, we echo their awe. Every scientist, every artist, every person who has ever stopped to gaze at the world in silence is, in some quiet way, one of them. So if the Watchers were ever real, and perhaps they still are, in some hidden fold of time, then they have never truly vanished. Their civilization may have dissolved, but their gaze remains, living through ours. The Earth, after all, remembers everything, even those who learned only to watch. Somewhere in the stillness between heartbeat and breath, in the way we pause before beauty, the observers live on silent, patient, eternal. Chapter 7. The Language of the World. If you spend enough time in silence, the world begins to speak in ways that words cannot. It does not use sentences or grammar, nor does it shout or argue. It murmurs through wind, through water, through the slow shifting of light across leaves. It tells its stories in cycles, in echoes, in the repetition of form. Perhaps this was what the ancient watchers discovered long ago, that the world itself has a language, one that can be read but not written, one that can be heard only by those willing to listen without expectation. In the age of the first mammals, when the forests were thick with ferns and the nights glowed faintly from the lingering heat of the earth, this language would have been everywhere. The watchers, if they still existed, would have been fluent in it. They would not have relied on spoken tongues as we do. To them, communication might have meant resonance, a shared awareness, a sense of pattern recognized between minds and the world around them. They might have learned to read the rhythm of rainfall as one reads poetry, or the texture of rock layers as one reads history. Imagine them standing at dawn beside a river that has carved its path for millions of years. The air is still, heavy with the scent of wet earth. In the distance, the first mammals stir in the undergrowth. The watchers kneel and trace the lines of sediment with their fingers. Each layer holds memory, a flood, a drought, a season of ash from volcanic fire. They would have seen it not as mere geology, but as language, the Earth's script written slowly in the patience of time. To them, the world was not a collection of objects, but a conversation, one they had spent ages learning to follow. Perhaps they believed that all things spoke, not just in metaphor, but in presence. The movement of a fern in the wind could be a phrase. The hiss of steam from a vent could be a sigh. The glow of bioluminescent fungus along a cave wall could be a thought. It wasn't superstition, it was attentiveness. In every vibration, they sensed intention. They didn't worship the earth as a deity, but they recognized it as conscious in its own way, vast, slow, and articulate beyond measure. To them, the entire planet was speaking, and they were merely one dialect among many. We humans, with all our technologies and languages, have largely forgotten this fluency. But sometimes, when we stand before the sea and feel something stir within us that we cannot name, we are remembering. The language of the world doesn't need translation, it needs stillness. It asks us to listen not with the mind, but with the whole body. The watchers knew this instinctively. They had no written words because they lived within the world's ongoing sentence. Their knowledge was woven into observation, not preserved in ink or symbol. Imagine, for a moment, one of their rituals. At twilight, they gather in a circle near the mouth of a steaming fissure in the earth. The air vibrates with heat, carrying faint tones, the low hum of magma deep below. They close their eyes, listening. The hum grows stronger, resonating through the ground, through their bones. They begin to hum back, matching the vibration. It isn't song in the way we understand it, it's a dialogue, an attempt to align themselves with the planet's own pulse. For them, harmony was not aesthetic but spiritual alignment. To be in tune with the world's vibration was to exist correctly, to live truthfully. This practice might seem alien to us, but in essence, it isn't so different from what we do when we sit quietly by the ocean, or when we find ourselves inexplicably comforted by the sound of rain. Somewhere inside, we recognize that we too are part of this vast conversation. The watchers simply never forgot that fact. Their language wasn't one of domination or distinction, it was one of belonging. The mammals too were learning their own dialect of survival. Their communication was simpler, sniffs, clicks, cries, but no less profound. The watchers might have noticed patterns even in those sounds, rhythms that reflected the flow of life itself. Perhaps they saw the mammals as apprentices in the art of listening, creatures whose instincts still held the memory of unity with nature. The mammals were not yet storytellers, but they were living stories, embodiments of evolution's ongoing experiment. When the watchers looked upon them, they might have recognized that life, at every level, is communication. Cells speak through chemical signals, forests speak through networks of roots and fungi, oceans speak through currents and tides. Even the stones, slowly grinding against one another under the weight of mountains, exchange messages of pressure and heat. The universe is not silent, it hums constantly with interaction. The watchers were simply among the few who could hear it clearly. If we could translate the world's language, what would it say? Perhaps it would tell us that destruction and creation are not enemies but collaborators. That nothing truly ends, it changes form and continues speaking in another tone. The volcanic eruptions that once devastated the land gave birth to fertile soil. The extinctions that wiped out whole species made space for new ones to emerge. Even silence, in the world's grammar, is not emptiness but pause a breath before the next word. In those days, when the earth was still hot to the touch and the stars burned brighter through thin clouds of ash, the watchers might have written their understanding into the landscape itself. Not words, but alignments. Stones placed to mirror the stars, pathways shaped to follow the curvature of rivers, patterns carved into hillsides that could only be seen from above, perhaps intended not for eyes, but for the earth to recognize itself through them. If we've ever stumbled upon such places, those ancient geometries etched into land, we may have mistaken them for coincidence. But maybe they are remnants of the dialogue, fossils of meaning. As centuries turned to millennia, the watchers must have realized that their language was fading. The earth would continue to speak, but the beings who could understand it were vanishing. The mammals, though intelligent in their way, were becoming creatures of instinct, their awareness turning inward, away from the slow voice of the world. Perhaps that was the necessary next step, to forget for a time, so that one day we could rediscover listening anew. Every cycle requires a silence before rebirth. On the night of their final gathering, imagine the watchers sitting beneath a sky they had known for eons, now subtly changed. The constellations drifted, the seasons altered. Around them, the world hummed with life they had nurtured through their reverence. They did not speak to one another. They simply listened to the insects, to the wind moving through trees, to the deep, unbroken heartbeat of the planet. It was a farewell, not of sorrow, but of completion. They had become fluent enough in the world's language to understand that endings are just transitions. Perhaps that is why we, their distant inheritors, still feel awe in the presence of natural beauty. When we stare at the vastness of an ocean or the quiet of a forest, some buried instinct stirs. Something deep within us recognizes the language being spoken, even if we've forgotten the words. It feels like nostalgia for something we've never lived, a memory older than humanity. Maybe that is the legacy of the watchers, the ability to sense meaning in silence, to find connection in pattern, to feel spoken to by the universe itself. The language of the world has never gone silent. It continues, flowing beneath our noise, whispering through every breeze, every shifting tide, every flicker of starlight. We only need to slow down enough to hear it again. The watchers once stood where we now stand, listening. And perhaps, in their way, they knew that one day, we too would awaken to the same realization that the earth is not mute, and we were never meant to be its masters, only its translators. Chapter 8. The Long Silence. Every civilization, no matter how luminous, eventually meets its quiet dusk. The earth remembers in layers, not in voices, and so when a people fade, their language, their dreams, their laughter dissolve into sediment and pressure, leaving only texture, never meaning. The watchers, who had once stood as witnesses to the rebirth of life after the great dying, must have felt the weight of that truth settling over them like dusk over a valley. There comes a moment when even those who understood the patience of time must yield to its tide. The long silence began not with catastrophe, but with stillness. Imagine them as they once were spread across the recovering continents, living in small enclaves of quiet intelligence. For ages they had observed the world's rhythms, tracking migrations, seasons, and the subtle ways the earth spoke through tremor and wind. They lived by the pace of the planet itself, never rushing, never fighting against the inevitable. But even such wisdom cannot last forever. The world was changing again. Forests thickened, climates shifted, oceans drew in and flooded out with new patterns. New species evolved, each one a note in the ever-expanding song of life. The watchers began to realize that the song no longer needed them. Their numbers had already begun to dwindle. Perhaps they had grown too few to sustain themselves, or too detached from survival's demands. They had lived for understanding, not expansion. They had devoted their time to listening rather than competing. And in nature's endless experiment, such gentleness is rarely rewarded with longevity. But even as they faded, they would have done so gracefully, their decline a conscious act rather than a defeat. To them, disappearance was not tragedy, it was transformation. We might imagine one of them walking alone across a vast floodplain in twilight. The air is thick with humidity and the hum of insects. Each step sinks slightly into the wet soil, releasing the scent of minerals and decay. Behind them, their home, perhaps a cluster of cavern dwellings carved into stone, is silent now, overgrown with vines. Ahead lies only open land, dotted with ferns and conifers. They stop for a moment and listen. The world is alive, with sound, but none of it is familiar. The creatures that move through the brush are strangers, their calls strange, their shapes unfamiliar. For the first time, the watcher feels not reverence, but distance. The earth has outgrown them. That moment, multiplied across their dwindling communities, would mark the beginning of the long silence. One by one, the observers withdrew. Some may have gone deeper underground, retreating into the caverns that had once protected them during the cataclysmic past. Others may have followed the rivers toward the sea, seeking peace in the rhythm of tides. Perhaps a few, sensing the inevitability of their fading, performed final rites ceremonies not of mourning but of release. They may have gathered at sacred places where fire met stone, where the earth's breath rose from vents in the ground, and there they would have offered themselves to time, returning their bodies and knowledge to the cycle from which it all began. Silence, after all, was their oldest companion. They had lived through the end of one world before. They understood how easily life can vanish, and how gently it can begin again. The silence that followed their disappearance would not have been emptiness, but incubation. In that stillness, the first mammals continued their quiet ascent, unaware that they were being passed a torch they could not yet carry. The watchers had done their part, they had observed, understood, and accepted. Now it was time for the world to move without them. From our perspective, millions of years later, their absence feels like erasure. We look for traces, fossils, artifacts, messages, and find none. But absence itself can be a kind of presence. The earth is not careless with what it consumes. It transforms. The watcher's knowledge may not have survived in form, but perhaps it persists in resonance. Maybe the instinct to wonder, to look at the stars and question, to listen to the wind and feel meaning in its motion. Maybe that is their inheritance, woven into the consciousness of the creatures that came after. In that sense, they never disappeared. They simply became quieter, their wisdom distributed like dust across the fabric of life. Still, the thought of their final years lingers like a shadowed melody. Picture a gathering at dusk, one of their last. The air glows with the red light of a setting sun filtered through volcanic haze. A few remaining watchers sit in a circle, their faces lined with both age and serenity. Between them burns a low fire fed by resinous branches. They do not speak, for speech has become unnecessary. Instead, they share glances, faint smiles, and the unspoken understanding that they have seen enough. Around them, the forest murmurs. A small mammal darts past, its quick feet leaving tiny impressions in the ash. One of the watchers follows it with their eyes, and perhaps, in that moment, they realize that this is how memory survives, not through permanence, but through continuation. The long silence stretched across epochs. As continents drifted, the last evidence of their existence was buried beneath sediment or consumed by magma. Their tools, if they had any, would have become indistinguishable from stone. Their dwellings collapsed into caves, their symbols into veins of mineral and fossil. The planet, ever patient, folded them into itself, carrying their story within its layers. When the crust rose again to form mountains or broke apart to form oceans, fragments of them may have resurfaced, but no one was left to know what they were. To think of them now is to hear faint echoes where no sound remains. The silence they left behind is not empty, it's full, like the pause before music resumes. Perhaps it is the same silence we hear in moments of awe, standing before the ocean, gazing up at the stars, feeling small but connected. That sensation, the sense that someone, somewhere, is listening with us, might be their voice still whispering beneath the surface of time. And maybe the earth itself remembers them. The forests that grew where they once lived might still carry their resonance. The patterns of roots and rivers might echo their language, repeating shapes they once carved in stone. Every living thing is a kind of memory. If you believe that consciousness is not destroyed but transformed, then perhaps the watcher's awareness still drifts through the biosphere, scattered but present part of the hum of life itself. The long silence, then, is not a void, it is a threshold. Out of it, new voices emerge. The calls of mammals, the songs of birds, the eventual murmur of human speech. Each of these is, in a way, a continuation of the watcher's listening. We are what happens when observation becomes expression, when the need to watch turns into the need to speak. The silence was the bridge between those two moments. In this way, their vanishing becomes a kind of gift, for if they had not faded, if they had clung to life and power, perhaps the space for our own awakening would never have opened. The long silence was necessary. It gave the earth time to dream new dreams, to let life reinvent itself once more. And so, when we listen to the world now, when we hear the hush before dawn, the stillness before rain, or the long, slow quiet of twilight, we are listening to that same ancient pause, the silence of a world catching its breath before speaking again. Perhaps, even now, they are listening still, not as beings of flesh, but as part of the deep awareness that moves through everything. When a breeze touches your face, or when the earth trembles faintly beneath your feet, it might be their voice, soft and patient, reminding us that silence is not the absence of life. It is the space in which life gathers the strength to continue. And in that space, as in theirs, everything begins again. Chapter 9. The Memory in Stone. Stone is the planet's handwriting. Every ridge, every vein, every folded layer of mineral is a sentence written in a language older than words. We walk across pages every day without reading them, unaware that beneath our feet lie billions of years of recorded time. The earth never forgets, it only writes more deeply, burying its memories under the pressure of its own becoming. If the watchers ever lived, their story is still here, compressed in the crust, whispered in fault lines, embedded in the patient memory of stone. To imagine the memory of stone, you must first think of time not as a line but as an ocean. The surface waves are moments, the days, the years, the histories we can grasp, but beneath them are slow currents that move so gently we can hardly perceive their motion. Rock is that deep current, time slowed to the pace of minerals. What we call solid is merely the illusion of stillness. Even mountains flow, given enough time. And within that slow flow, everything that has ever existed is preserved in some form, transmuted by pressure and heat. Civilizations may crumble, species may vanish, but their essence becomes part of the rock's slow story. If the watchers were real, their fingerprints are not gone, they are metamorphosed. Their dwellings might have turned to quartz veins, their tools to sediment, their written symbols to faint striations mistaken for natural pattern. Perhaps their very bodies, once flesh and bone, have been reworked into the minerals we now extract to build our own civilizations. The stone that forms the foundations of our homes, the crystals in our devices, the metals that hum in our circuits. What if all of it is, in some way, their remains? We might be holding the memory of them in our hands without knowing it. It is comforting, in a way, to think that nothing is truly lost. That memory, even without a keeper, finds a way to endure. The watchers, who lived for understanding, might have foreseen this. Perhaps they left messages designed not for eyes or ears, but for geology itself, patterns meant to be recorded in the arrangement of minerals, in the flow of lava, in the magnetic alignments of cooling stone. A message written not in ink or sound, but in structure. To them, permanence would not have meant survival through centuries, but through epochs. They would have understood that only the earth itself could serve as an eternal archive. There are moments when we stumble across something. An unusual symmetry in a cliff face, a perfectly geometric pattern in a crystal, a fossil formation that seems almost intentional, and for a brief instant, it feels like recognition. It's as though the stone remembers being shaped. Science explains these phenomena with precision: crystallization, erosion, compression. But understanding a process does not negate its poetry. The watchers, if they still lingered in spirit, might smile at our explanations. They would not correct us, because they knew that knowledge is just one dialect of wonder. To walk through the world with this awareness is to see differently. The granite mountain is no longer immovable. It becomes an idea made tangible, a thought that took millions of years to form. The boulder in a field is not merely debris, it's a traveller carried by glaciers across continents. Even the dust in the air carries fragments of ancient stone, ground from the bones of mountains long vanished. Every breath we take is heavy with history. The watchers must have known this intimately. They may have even believed that memory itself was not confined to living minds but distributed through matter. Every atom remembers where it has been. There is a certain humility in this thought. We tend to think of memory as something fragile, confined to the fleeting chemistry of brain and emotion. But the Earth's memory is indifferent to such frailty. It is unhurried, unfeeling, and yet profoundly faithful. If the Watchers had philosophies, they might have centered on this idea that remembrance is not a human act but a cosmic one. The stars remember their births in light. The oceans remember the pull of the moon in tides. The stones remember everything. Imagine one of them, near the end of their age, carving something into a wall of cooling basalt. Not words, not pictures, but a pattern of grooves, a rhythm of meaning only the earth itself could hold. As the centuries passed, lava would cover it, sediment would bury it, and yet the pattern would remain, encoded in the crystalline structure of the rock. Perhaps somewhere, deep beneath our modern feet, that mark still exists, a fragment of communication between the living and the eternal. When geologists split open rocks and examine their bands and inclusions, they are reading more than they know. Each line is a heartbeat of the planet. The Watchers might have predicted that one day, beings like us would read the Earth's story scientifically, without realizing that science is simply another form of reverence. Every discovery we make, each fossil unearthed, each isotope measured is another translation of the same ancient text. The Earth has always been teaching. We are just beginning to remember its language. Sometimes, the planet gives us glimpses of its memory too vivid to ignore. A mountain reveals a hidden fossil, the imprint of a creature's final moment preserved in exquisite detail. A canyon opens, showing layers upon layers of colour, each one an era, a heartbeat, a memory. Standing at the edge of such vastness, one cannot help but feel watched. The Earth, with its silent layers, seems almost sentient, as if it recognizes the gaze of those who can finally read it. Maybe this is how the Watchers felt in their time, humbled and awed by the immensity of what they observed. And perhaps, in some strange symmetry, the Earth remembers them because we do. When we imagine them, when we wonder who they were or if they existed, we awaken the possibility within the planet's memory. The act of thinking about them is like tracing a finger over a half-buried inscription. The meaning becomes clearer, if only for a moment. Memory requires recognition, after all, and maybe we are the mind the Earth uses to remember itself. There's a quiet power in this idea that consciousness did not emerge against nature but through it as an instrument for recollection. The Watchers, then, were not separate from the world. They were part of its nervous system, the first neurons firing in the vast body of the planet. Their disappearance wasn't a loss but a transformation, a passing of awareness into new forms. The first mammals, then us, then whatever comes next, all iterations of the same impulse to observe, to record, to remember. If you go into a desert and listen to the wind move over stone, you can almost hear it, the low hum of memory, the sand shifting, the rocks cracking under heat, the subtle resonance that fills the still air. It sounds like silence, but it isn't. It's the Earth speaking in the only voice it has left, the voice of endurance. The Watchers once understood that language. Maybe, deep down, we still do. The memory in stone is not just a record, it's a reminder. Everything that has ever lived becomes part of the foundation for what comes next. The Watchers are gone, but their thoughts are folded into the strata beneath us. When the wind erodes a cliff and exposes a fossil, when a mountain collapses into dust, when we hold a piece of rock and marvel at its age, we are touching the continuity of all that has ever been. And so, when you walk outside tonight, look for the nearest stone. Feel its weight, its coolness, its quiet patience. That silence you feel is not absence. It is the sound of everything that ever existed, still waiting to be heard. The Watchers knew this truth long ago. That stone does not sleep, it remembers. And in remembering, it keeps the story alive, waiting for anyone to listen again. Chapter 10. The Mammalian Dawn. The long silence did not last forever. Nothing in nature is truly still. Even quiet contains movement. Even darkness holds the seeds of light. After the Watchers faded into myth and memory, the world continued its slow turning. The air cooled, the forests thickened, and the small, warm-blooded creatures that had crept in the shadows began to multiply. The age of giants gave way to an age of survivors. What had begun as whispers in the underbrush would, in time, become a new chorus, the dawn of the mammals. To imagine that dawn, you must first understand that it was not sudden. Evolution, like sunrise, happens gradually. At first, there is only dim light, a suggestion of change. The reptiles still ruled the earth, vast and armoured, their dominance stretching over plains and jungles alike. Yet beneath their feet, hidden in burrows and hollows, something else was stirring, a quiet intelligence wrapped in fur and instinct. These small creatures, no larger than rats or shrews, carried in them the blueprint of what was to come. They were the first mammals to thrive, not despite the power of the reptiles, but because of their own mastery of the margins. Imagine a forest at the edge of an ancient river. Mist curls over the ferns, and the air is rich with the scent of resin and soil. The sun is pale behind a haze of moisture. A small mammal emerges from a pellether burrow, its eyes bright and wary. It pauses to listen. The world is full of danger, but then scurries toward the water. Its paws press tiny patterns into the mud. It drinks quickly, ears twitching. The ripples in the river reflect its image, distorted by time, a fleeting reflection of what the future will one day recognize as kin. This is what the beginning of a new era looks like. Small, fragile, but unstoppable. The mammals were not conquerors, they were opportunists. Where the reptiles sought the sun, the mammals sought the shadows. They lived by night, their senses tuned to the whispers of the world rather than its roars. Their hearing was sharp, their noses sensitive, their movements deliberate, warm-blooded and furred. They carried their own heat with them, unbound by the chill of night or the cool of dawn. For millions of years, this was their secret survival, not through power, but through adaptability. If the Watchers still existed in some hidden form, perhaps as scattered remnants of their old civilization, or as beings merged into the earth itself, they would have recognized in these creatures something wondrous. The mammals embodied everything they had once cherished: resilience, curiosity, and the quiet defiance of life's persistence. Perhaps the Watchers, before fading completely, had whispered their understanding into the fabric of the world itself, leaving behind not technology but tendencies, the urge to nurture, the impulse to explore, the capacity for empathy. In the mammals, these qualities began to take shape. Their world was one of constant risk, but also of constant innovation. Each generation adapted a little better. The bones of their jaws refined into the delicate mechanisms of the modern ear, allowing them to hear more precisely. Their brains grew, small folds of tissue curling into complexity. They began to develop memory, pattern recognition, even emotion. A mother would guard her young not out of instinct alone, but out of the form of attachment, a bond deeper than survival. Every gesture of care was a step toward consciousness. The forests of that time were dense and humid, filled with ferns that reached the height of small trees. The nights glowed faintly with the light of insects. To walk through such a forest would have been like stepping into a dream where the air itself breathed. Each sound carried meaning. The crack of a twig, the rustle of wings, the low croak of amphibians in the distance. For the mammals, every sense mattered. They were learning to interpret their world not as noise, but as information, a skill that would one day become thought. The Watchers, if they observed from afar, might have seen in this subtle awakening the promise of something familiar. Perhaps they understood that intelligence was not a singular event, but a rhythm. It rises, it fades, it returns. Civilizations, species, and minds all follow this same pulse. The mammals, in their simplicity, were becoming the next verse of that ancient song. The Watcher's silence was not an ending, it was an overture. There's a certain poetry in how evolution moves. The mammals never sought to replace the reptiles. They simply lived differently. While the dinosaurs grew vast and specialized, the mammals remained small and adaptable, capable of surviving where others could not. When the Earth shifted again, when fire and dust blotted out the sun at the end of the Cretaceous, it was not the mighty that endured, it was the meek. The world turned once more, and in the ashes of the old age, the mammals rose into daylight for the first time. Imagine that morning after extinction. The sky is pale and heavy with ash. The forests are quiet, their canopy broken. The air smells of smoke and renewal. From beneath a fallen log, a small creature emerges, blinking against the strange light. It sniffs the air, sensing absence. The thunderous steps of the great reptiles are gone. The world, for the first time in 100 million years, is still. The mammals, timid but tenacious, begin to spread. They climb, they dig, they explore. The earth is theirs now, though they do not yet know it. This is how the dawn of a new era begins, not with triumph, but with quiet persistence. The mammals did not celebrate their inheritance, they simply continued living. But life, in its persistence, is the greatest celebration of all. Each breath they took, each step they made through the soft soil, was a continuation of everything that had come before the ancient oceans, the great forests, the long silences. Evolution does not erase, it composes. The mammals carried within them the memories of all their ancestors, the DNA of countless forms that had risen and fallen. They were walking archives of survival. Over time, they diversified. Some remained small, living in burrows and trees. Others grew larger, exploring plains and mountains. The earth was reshaping itself again, the continents drifting into forms that would one day feel familiar. And with every generation, the mammals' eyes grew a little sharper, their minds a little deeper. They learned to use tools of instinct: sticks, stones, paws. In their genes, the potential for thought lay dormant, waiting for the right moment to bloom. The watchers, if they still lingered as spirit or energy, would have watched this transformation with a kind of cosmic satisfaction. The experiment continued. The earth was still thinking, still dreaming through its creations. In those small, warm hearts beating beneath the stars, the same awareness that once gazed at the sky in wonder was beginning to reawaken. It would take tens of millions of years, but the spark had been lit again. The mammals inherited not a kingdom, but a question, the same question the watchers had once asked. What does it mean to live, to feel, to remember? Every species would answer in its own way. Some would thrive through cooperation, others through cunning, others through endurance. And one day, one lineage among them would take that question and shape it into words, stories, and meaning. But for now, at the dawn of their age, it was enough to simply exist. The dawn of the mammals was not a victory, it was a beginning. A quiet light spreading through the darkness, slow and patient, unstoppable. The watchers' eyes, wherever they were, would have softened in understanding. The world was awake again. The silence had spoken, and life had listened. The new age had begun, not in fire, not in glory, but in the steady rhythm of tiny hearts beating against the vast, eternal pulse of the earth. Chapter 11. Dreaming in the fossil record time. When it becomes deep enough, starts to resemble sleep. The surface of the earth may change, mountains rising, seas collapsing, climates shifting. But beneath all of that, in the quiet layers of sediment and stone, there is a kind of dreaming. Each fossil is a fragment of that dream, a preserved thought of the planet itself. The bones, shells, and impressions we find scattered through the strata are not merely relics of the dead. They are memories of what once moved, breathed, and wondered, turned into stillness. The fossil record, then, is not just evidence, it is imagination made physical. The Earth's long memory turned to stone. To look at a fossil is to stare into a pause between heartbeats. Millions of years stretch thin between the moment of a creature's death and the moment it is rediscovered. That gap, the span between life and rediscovery, is a dream the planet has been having, unbroken. Imagine a creature, perhaps one of those early mammals, dying beneath a fallen tree in a Triassic forest. Its small body settles into mud, its warmth fading, its fur carried away by water. Over time, the soft parts vanish, but the bones remain. Layers of silt cover it, pressing down year after year, century after century, until the bones turn to stone. The creature is no longer alive, but not gone either. It has become a word in the Earth's ancient language, a syllable in a story still being written. When we find fossils, we like to say we are uncovering history, but perhaps we are also waking dreams. The watchers, if they ever existed, would have understood this. They would have seen the process not as death, but as translation life converted into another form of memory. Maybe they even understood how to read it. To us, a fossil is a shape. To them, it might have been a sentence, a record of the planet's thought at a particular moment in time. Perhaps they knew that the Earth dreams of itself through the living things it creates, and that fossils are the echoes of those dreams, left behind for whoever comes next. Imagine them walking along a riverbed millions of years before us, examining the stones with eyes trained to see what we cannot. Perhaps they traced their fingers along the faint impressions of shells, the outlines of leaves, the delicate bones of creatures long vanished. They would not have needed to dig, they would have known where to look, guided by the rhythms of erosion and time. To them, each fossil was not a curiosity but a conversation. They might have said that these were not the remains of the past, but glimpses of the planet's inner life. There's a tenderness in the thought that the world keeps dreams of its creatures. Even extinction, which seems so final to us, is only a change of form. Nothing vanishes completely. The watchers may have taught themselves to listen for what still speaks from within the rock. The faint vibrations, the crystalline structures, the way certain stones hum under the right pressure. Perhaps those were their scriptures, their libraries. They didn't need books, because the earth itself was their text. We can feel some of that same reverence when we hold a fossil in our hands. The first thing that strikes you is its weight. Fossils are heavy, denser than they appear, as though they are carrying the gravity of all, the time they have survived. There's a faint chill to them too, a coolness that feels like stillness embodied. If you close your eyes, you can almost imagine the warmth that once flowed through that shape, the heartbeat that once pulsed. You can almost sense the watcher's hands doing the same gesture millions of years before touching, wondering, understanding. And yet, fossils are also incomplete. They are fragments of something much larger, pieces of a dream we will never fully reconstruct. Perhaps that incompleteness is part of the beauty. The watchers might have believed that knowledge was not about possession but participation. To study the fossil record was not to solve it, but to enter it, to feel its rhythm, its patience. They might have said that every fossil is an invitation, not a revelation. We are not meant to know the whole story, only to feel it continue through us. There's something almost mystical about the way fossils endure. They survive fire, flood, and pressure beyond imagination. They persist through the collapse of continents and the death of stars whose dust once seeded their creation. They are, in every sense, immortal impressions. But even immortality, in the language of the earth, is temporary. Given enough time, even fossils return to dust, folded back into the mantle, their shapes lost to metamorphosis. And yet, even then, their existence leaves traces, chemical signatures, magnetic alignments, echoes in the structure of newer rocks. Nothing ever truly vanishes. The Earth's dream continues, layered upon itself, age after age. The watchers might have known that this continuity was the true miracle. To them, time would not have been a river, but a spiral always returning, always echoing. They may have even seen themselves in the fossils they studied, aware that one day their own forms would join that slow conversation. Perhaps they did so willingly, lying down in certain places, understanding that the earth would one day turn. Be them into symbols, not monuments to be seen, but memories to be felt. Their legacy, then, would not be a city or a technology, but a resonance carried forward through stone and consciousness alike. In our own way, we have become watchers too. The first time a human unearthed a fossil and recognized it as the remains of something ancient, we began to remember more than our own lives. We began to participate in the dream again. Paleontology, geology, archaeology, all of these are forms of listening. Each fossil we find is like the echo of a forgotten song, faint but clear enough to hum along to. When we hold them, we aren't just studying them, we're finishing a conversation that began long before language. It's strange, isn't it, how fossils seem both alien and familiar. They belong to a world that feels utterly different from ours. Yet when we see their forms, the curve of a spine, the socket of an eye, we recognize something of ourselves. That recognition might be the oldest emotion on Earth. The watchers must have felt it too. The quiet awe of realizing that the story of life is one long mirror, and that even the most ancient creatures are reflections of what we still are. Perhaps that is why the Earth dreams in stone, to remind itself of what it has been, so that it can imagine what it will be next. Each fossil, each imprint, is a rehearsal for something still to come. The watchers saw that the mammals, small and shivering in the ferns, were the continuation of something much older. We, too, are the continuation of them. And someday, Far into the future, our own bones will turn to stone, our civilizations to dust, our fossils to stories that new eyes will read. The dream will go on, unbroken. If you could stand in the stillness of deep time, if you could hear the faint grinding of tectonic plates, the slow settling of sand over bones, you might realize that the planet has never truly been asleep. Its dreaming is its waking. Every fossil, every layer, every echo of a vanished world is part of a consciousness too vast for us to fully grasp. And yet, we are inside it. The Watchers once knew this. We are only beginning to remember. So the next time you find yourself near a stone, any stone, pick it up and hold it to the light. Look closely at its surface, its texture, its color. Somewhere within that small fragment, you are looking at time itself, a story billions of years in the making. The Earth is still dreaming, and through you, it is learning to remember out loud. Chapter 12. The Pulse of Evolution. The world has never truly stood still. Even when the air seems calm and the mountains seem ancient, the Earth is moving, reshaping, remembering. Beneath the quiet crust, molten rock drifts and folds like a slow heartbeat, and life above it pulses in time. Evolution, at its core, is not just a biological process, it's rhythm. It's the planet breathing, adjusting, dreaming itself into new forms again and again. And if one listens closely enough, one can almost hear it. That deep, slow pulse that connects every creature that has ever lived, from the smallest microbe to the most complex mind. The Watchers, if they had endured long enough to sense it, would have known this pulse intimately. It was the sound that guided their civilizations, the unspoken truth that every age rises not from chaos, but from continuity. They might have felt it in the tremors beneath their feet, in the tides that obeyed distant moons, in the wind that carried seeds from one continent to another. To them, evolution would not have seemed like chance. It would have felt like a language of change, a slow symphony in which every life was a note, every extinction a pause, every adaptation a new chord. Imagine the Earth during the early Cenozoic, after the dinosaurs had vanished and the world once again belonged to the small and the brave. The continents were drifting toward their modern forms, the air warming, the forests growing, dense and lush. The mammals, who had once lived in fear of the reptiles' shadow, now roamed freely, exploring niches that had been empty for millions of years. They began to grow, not just in size but in potential. Some took to the trees, others to the seas, and some, with patient persistence, learned to stand and see further. Evolution's pulse was quickening. If one could slow time enough to watch it happen, it would look almost like breathing. Species appear and vanish like exhalations, each one influencing the next. A tiny change in one leads to ripples through the rest. Teeth sharpen, fur thickens, limbs lengthen, senses refine. What looks to us like the randomness of adaptation might have felt, to the Watchers, like music, not predictable, but harmonious. A pattern emerging from motion, just as waves organize chaos into rhythm. The mammals that survived carried within them all the resilience of the ages before them. Their bones bore the memory of fish that once swam in ancient seas, of reptiles that once crawled through primeval swamps, of forgotten ancestors that had witnessed the great dying and refused to yield. Evolution doesn't create from nothing, it repurposes. Every feature, every instinct, is an echo of something older, transformed for a new age. Even now, within us, there are whispers of those first mammals hiding from predators in the Triassic night, their hearts beating fast, their eyes wide and alert. We are made of their endurance. The Watchers, if their wisdom had turned to legend rather than extinction, might have understood that evolution is not about progress but persistence. It does not march forward toward perfection, it meanders, it experiments, it learns. It fails more often than it succeeds, but its failures feed its next attempts. It is not a ladder, but a pulse, expanding, contracting, exploring. They might have seen themselves not as separate from it, but as participants in its rhythm. Perhaps they even shaped it, subtly, through their understanding, planting, tending, adjusting, guiding the flow of life like gardeners who work not with plants but with time itself. When we look at fossils, we often draw straight lines from ancestor to descendant, from simple to complex. But the Watchers might have seen a more intricate pattern, a spiral, endlessly weaving back through itself. Every species carries not just its own story, but the stories of all that came before. Each change is built from memory. That is the true pulse of evolution, not advancement, but remembrance. The planet never starts over completely. It builds upon what was. You can imagine the world as the watchers might have seen it, alive with motion invisible to us. Trees reaching higher each generation, birds perfecting their flight, oceans teeming with experiments of form and function. Every creature testing a possibility, every failure returning to the soil to nourish the next. Even extinction, terrible as it seems, is part of the pulse, a contraction that precedes expansion. Life does not retreat out of despair, but to gather strength for its next creation. In that sense, evolution is not a scientist but an artist. It does not plan, but it feels. It works through improvisation, guided by the music of necessity. And like all great art, it is patient. The watchers, if they stood on the cliffs of the ancient world and gazed out across the forests and plains, would have seen that patience in motion, the slow, beautiful persistence of trial and renewal. Perhaps they called it something different then, something sacred. Perhaps they named it simply the living rhythm. In every heartbeat of every creature, that rhythm continues. The first mammals felt it when they trembled in the dark, their hearts quick and fierce. The great whales feel it now, their vast pulses echoing through the sea. Even the smallest bird carries it in the flutter of its wings, a tempo perfectly tuned to the planet's breath. The watchers might have believed that this shared rhythm was proof that all life was one body, the Earth itself, dreaming through infinite forms. When they disappeared, they did not take that knowledge with them. It remained in the pulse. Life inherited it. Every species that survived carried a fragment of their understanding within its DNA, and we, as the latest expression of that lineage, still feel it. When our hearts beat, they echo the same rhythm that once guided the evolution of every creature before us. We are, in a way, the living memory of the planet's pulse, made self-aware enough to marvel at it. Sometimes, late at night, when the world around you grows still, you can feel it too. The gentle thrum beneath the quiet, the hum of life, of wind, of distant oceans turning. It's the same pulse that guided the first cells to divide, the same rhythm that pushed creatures to crawl from the sea, that carried mammals through the ashes of the dinosaurs. It's older than thought, older than fear, older than hope. It's the sound of continuity. The watchers might have understood that their purpose was never to rule or to last forever. Their purpose, like ours, was simply to be part of the rhythm, to feel it, to pass it on, to recognize that life is not something that happens on Earth. Life is the Earth. The pulse of evolution is the planet's heartbeat, and through every living thing, it continues to speak. When we study fossils or DNA, when we marvel at the endless creativity of life, we are not standing outside of evolution looking in. We are inside it, moving to its tempo. Our minds are another stage of its unfolding, our thoughts another form of its dreaming. Even our curiosity, this need to understand where we came from, is part of the same rhythm that once guided the first creatures toward the light. The watchers heard it, the mammals felt it, and now it beats within us too. So, listen. Beneath the noise of human life, the hum of cities, the rush of engines, there is still a quieter sound, steady and unbroken. The rhythm of the planet, the pulse of evolution. It's in the tides, the seasons, the migration of birds, the flicker of our own breathing. It is the reminder that nothing is ever lost, only transformed. And though the watchers have long since vanished, their understanding lingers, woven into the rhythm itself, a truth both ancient and eternal, that to live is to move in harmony with the pulse of creation, and to listen is to remember who we've always been. Chapter 13. Lessons from Extinction. Extinction is often imagined as an ending, a point of collapse after which nothing remains. We picture silence, emptiness, a sudden vanishing. But the Earth has never experienced true endings, only transitions. Every extinction, no matter how total it seems, is followed by renewal. Every silence is a pause before a new voice enters the song. It is difficult for us, who measure time by years and centuries, to feel the truth of that rhythm. But the planet remembers differently. It has endured 5 great extinctions already. and countless smaller ones, each one a moment of loss that gave rise to something unforeseen. The Watchers, if they still existed in the deep folds of time, would have known this pattern intimately. To them, extinction would not have been tragedy, but transformation. The universe resetting its canvas so that life could dream again. Imagine their perspective as they looked upon the fossilized remains of worlds long gone. They would have seen not failure, but evolution's punctuation marks. The Permian collapse that nearly erased all life would have appeared to them not as the end of the Earth's story, but as its first great renewal. The Cretaceous extinction, when fire rained from the sky and darkness covered the globe, would have been another verse in the same recurring melody. The Watchers would have understood that destruction and creation are partners, inseparable and necessary. Perhaps they even saw beauty in the balance that for every loss there would one day be a resurrection, different but born of the same eternal pulse. If we could share their patience, we might begin to understand our own place in that pattern. To live in the modern age is to witness the beginnings of another extinction, one that we ourselves have accelerated. Species vanish daily, climates shift, and the biosphere trembles under the weight of human ambition. It is easy to despair, to believe that the world is dying, but the Watchers would remind us that death, in the vocabulary of the Earth, is only metamorphosis. The question is not whether life will continue. It will, but what form it will take when we are gone. Extinction is not the failure of life. It is life's way of remembering how to begin again. When the Watchers studied extinction, they might have seen it not as chaos but as rhythm. Every few 100 million years, a great rebalancing sweeps across the planet. Volcanoes erupt, climates flip, oceans recede, and species vanish. Yet within that destruction lies opportunity. The Earth does not erase, it recycles. The Watchers, wise and weary, might have stood on volcanic cliffs and whispered that what we call catastrophe is merely the Earth breathing differently. They would have seen how life responds to loss not with surrender but with imagination. The survivors, those small, strange creatures that endure, become the architects of the next age. Consider the mammals. They were born in the shadows of extinction, inheriting a world scoured by fire and darkness. They did not dominate immediately. They crept quietly, filling the spaces that death had left empty. But in time, those quiet creatures became the foundation for an entirely new era. Evolution's creativity blossoms most fiercely after collapse. It is as if the universe, given a blank page, cannot resist drawing something unexpected. The Watchers might have called this impulse divine, though not in the sense of gods, but in the sense of sacred pattern, a creative principle that weaves continuity from ruin. To understand extinction is to learn humility. The Watchers surely knew this. They would have understood that no species, no matter how clever or vast, is immune to the cycles of change. Even they, for all their wisdom, faded into silence. Perhaps they accepted it peacefully, knowing that the next beings to rise would carry some echo of them forward. That is the hidden generosity of extinction. It is not theft but inheritance. What dies gives itself to what comes after. Forests return to soil, bones turn to mineral, memory dissolves into myth. The living feed the future. If we could think as the Watchers did, we might see our own civilization differently. We might stop clinging to the illusion of permanence and begin instead to think about continuity. What will we leave behind when our time ends? Not our machines or monuments, those will vanish quickly, but our ideas, our kindness, our capacity to wonder. Those are the things that evolution values most. If extinction teaches anything, it is that endurance belongs not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable, the most open to change. The Watchers knew this, and the mammals lived it. Now, it is our turn to decide whether we too can adapt not to resist change, but to move with it. Perhaps that was the true wisdom the Watchers tried to pass down, that extinction is not punishment but invitation, a chance for the world to remember balance, to start anew, unburdened by what no longer serves. They might have observed countless smaller cycles, forests burning only to regrow richer, rivers drying only to carve deeper paths when they return. Even the smallest acts of nature echo the same truth. Renewal requires release. The tree that drops its leaves is not dying, it is preparing for the next season. The Earth does the same on a planetary scale. There is a quiet comfort in this view. When we gaze at fossils or ruins, We are not looking at ghosts. We are looking at teachers. Each extinction carries a lesson, if we are willing to listen. The first is patience. Life does not hurry. The second is surrender what is lost makes room for what will be. And the third, perhaps the hardest to learn, is faith, that the universe tends always toward renewal, even when we cannot see it. The Watchers understood these truths so deeply that they shaped their civilization around them. They did not build to last forever. They built to dissolve gracefully. Their legacy was not a monument, but a philosophy. In our time, we fear endings more than anything else. We struggle against them, building walls, technologies, and stories to keep impermanence at bay. But what if the Watchers were right? What if the secret to survival is not resistance, but rhythm, learning to live and let go in tune with the planet's breathing? Perhaps our greatest task is not to prevent extinction, but to learn from it, to become aware participants in the eternal cycle of loss and rebirth. Imagine, for a moment, that the Watchers could see us now. They would see a world trembling under its own weight, forests thinning, oceans warming, species slipping quietly into memory. But they would also see something miraculous. Consciousness reflecting upon itself. Life aware of its own fragility for the first time. They might not see our situation as hopeless. They might whisper that this awareness, this deep recognition of impermanence, is exactly what the planet has been evolving toward all along. Perhaps we are not at the end of something, but at the beginning of understanding. Extinction humbles, but it also awakens. It teaches us to pay attention, to cherish what remains, to recognize beauty even in transience. The Watchers learned that lesson long ago and left it imprinted in the fabric of life. The mammals carried it forward in their cautious endurance. And now, as we stand at the edge of our own uncertain future, we can feel it again, the same pulse, the same quiet wisdom whispering through time. Extinction is the planet's reminder that life's story is not a straight line but a circle. Everything returns, transformed. Every loss becomes soil for new beginnings. And in that sense, the Watchers never truly vanished. They live on in the rhythm of the world, in every breath that moves through the forest, in every heartbeat that carries the memory of survival. The lesson they left behind is simple, and it waits patiently for us to remember. Endings are only ever beginnings seen from too close a distance. Chapter 14. When the Sky Remembered. There comes a time in every age when the sky changes. Sometimes it's a shift so slow that no creature can sense it, and sometimes it's sudden, a burst of light, a veil of ash, a new constellation blinking into view. The sky is the oldest witness, the first storyteller, the quiet archive of everything that has ever happened below. To the Watchers, if they endured long enough to see the mammals rise and the forest spread again, the sky would have been their scripture. They would have looked up each night, not just to measure time but to remember. For them, the stars were not distant. They were reflections, glowing fragments of the Earth's own memory cast upward. Imagine one of their last gatherings. The air is cool, the ferns still dripping from an evening rain. A group of them stands on an open plateau where the horizon stretches endlessly, and above them the sky has cleared after a long storm. The stars return, flickering like embers in a vast breathing fire. They watch in silence. The constellations have shifted slightly since the last age, the slow movement of continents and time bending even the heavens. And yet, in those points of light, they recognize patterns that echo their own story. Extinction and return, silence and awakening, light born again from darkness. The Watchers might have believed that the sky was the Earth's way of remembering itself. Just as fossils preserved the shape of what once lived, the stars preserved the rhythm of what once was. Each light, they may have thought, corresponded to a life, a species, a thought once dreamt and released into the cosmos. When the light of a star faded, it was not a death, but a completion. Its energy returned to the great cycle. Perhaps they even believed that their own consciousness after their final extinction would rise as light joining the pattern of memory above. This idea may not be far from truth. The atoms that make us were once stars. Every element in our bodies, carbon, calcium, oxygen, iron, was forged in the heart of ancient suns that exploded long before Earth existed. The sky remembers because it is our ancestor. The Watchers, with their deep awareness of connection, might have known this in ways we can only rediscover through science. They might have seen no division between heaven and earth, only a constant exchange of breath and energy. To them, the sky was not somewhere else. It was home seen from another angle. If they had instruments, they would not have been telescopes, but resonators devices meant to listen, not look. They would have studied vibration, the way starlight flickers and hums as it travels through the void. Perhaps they found meaning in those frequencies, decoding patterns of harmony that link the movement of galaxies to the rhythm of tides and seasons. It's possible that they even recorded these cosmic songs, not as data, but as meditative tones meant to align their spirits with the universe's music. They might have understood that the stars are not silent. They sing in wavelengths too vast for our limited senses. When the first mammals looked up at the night sky, their eyes reflected a faint glimmer of curiosity, though they couldn't yet understand it. Still, the gaze was there, the same wonder that would one day lead their descendants to name constellations and trace their histories. Through the stars. Perhaps the watchers foresaw this. Perhaps, as they faded, they looked upon those tiny, cautious creatures and felt peace, knowing that one day their memory would awaken again through other eyes. The watchers were not eternal, but the act of watching was. The universe's gaze never blinks. It only changes form. It is strange to think how the sky can look the same across millions of years and yet never truly be identical. Stars die, new ones are born, galaxies drift apart. Even light itself ages as it travels, stretching and dimming, carrying the memory of its origin across the infinite. The watchers, standing beneath those changing constellations, must have understood this fragility. To them, the sky was not permanent, but alive. It breathed, it aged, it evolved. It was a companion to the earth, mirroring her cycles of creation and collapse. Maybe that's why they treated the heavens not as gods, but as kin. Their rituals might have been simple gestures of gratitude, songs timed with the rising of certain stars, silences held at solstice or eclipse. Through these acts, they would have reaffirmed their place in the continuum. They would have known that to live was to participate in the dialogue between earth and sky, matter and light. And when their final days came, they might have faced extinction, not with fear, but with wonder, trusting that they were returning to the same radiance they had studied all their lives. We, too, live beneath that same remembering sky. Though we have filled our nights with the glow of cities and satellites, the old light still reaches us. Every photon that touches our skin has travelled billions of years to find us, carrying within it the memory of time before life, before watchers, before even the earth itself. When we look up, we are not gazing outward, we are looking back. The stars are fossils of light, and we are creatures of that same ancient fire. Perhaps this is why stargazing feels like recognition. The mind quiets, the heart slows, and for a moment we feel connected to something immeasurable. It is not the cold infinity of space that stirs us, but the familiarity of it, the realization that we belong to that immensity. The watchers might have smiled at our telescopes and equations, not because they were wrong, but because they were unnecessary. We are already part of what we seek to understand. The stars we study are made of the same dust that forms our thoughts. The universe is observing itself through us. If the watchers left any message, it might not have been carved into stone or preserved in fossil, but written in the constellations. Perhaps they arranged markers on Earth that align with distant stars, so that those who came after would look up and feel guided by the same patterns. Maybe the great myths of later humans, the hunters, the serpents, the mothers of light, are echoes of the watchers' own sky stories, passed down through the subconscious of species that had yet to awaken. Memory moves strangely through time. It doesn't need language. It only needs repetition. One can imagine that on their final night, when they knew their age was closing, the last watchers gathered beneath a vast sky untouched by cloud or smoke. They lay on their backs, the ground warm beneath them, and watched the stars drift slowly across the heavens. They did not pray, they did not cry, they simply watched, as they always had. Somewhere in that silence, they must have felt the pulse of evolution still beating steady, eternal, the same rhythm that would one day rise in the hearts of mammals, in the minds of humans, in the songs of whatever comes next. And perhaps, as their eyes dimmed, they saw what we sometimes glimpse in our quietest moments, the realization that the sky is not above us but within us. Its atoms are our atoms. Its light is our origin. The The watchers understood that to look at the stars is to look at ourselves from long ago. The universe is a mirror, endlessly reflecting its own awareness. Even now, when we step outside on a clear night and see the Milky Way stretching like a river of memory across the dark, we are continuing their ritual. We are remembering with the sky. The watchers may have vanished, but the act of looking, the reverent stillness of curiosity, endures. The stars that guided them still shine, their light falling softly on new eyes. And as long as there are eyes to see and minds to wonder, the universe will keep remembering itself through watchers, through mammals, through us, and through whatever dreams come next beneath that same infinite living sky. Chapter 15. The Return of Awareness. There is a point in every story where memory stirs, where something once lost begins to surface again, not as a perfect recollection, but as a feeling. Awareness does not return suddenly. It arrives like dawn, faint at first, unnoticed by most, then growing until everything it touches begins to glow with meaning. Perhaps that is how it happened for the mammals. After millions of years of instinct and adaptation, something within them began to shift. Their eyes, which once scanned only for danger or food, began to linger. They started to watch, not just survive. Somewhere in that quiet awakening, the pulse of consciousness began again, the same one that had once guided the watchers. Imagine the forests of the early Cenozoic, filled with rustling leaves and the scent of damp earth. Life flourished in shapes both familiar and strange: early primates leaping between branches, hoofed creatures grazing in meadows, giant birds stalking through the ferns. The earth was rich again, its silence replaced by the sound of movement, of calling and answering. Amid this abundance, one small lineage of mammals began to notice patterns. The rustle of wind through trees, the repetition of stars overhead, the cycle of day and night all began to register, not merely as instinctual cues, but as signs of continuity. Awareness was returning, but this time it was different. It was no longer detached as it had been with the watchers. It was embedded in emotion, in curiosity, in the tenderness of care. For the watchers, understanding had been a sacred discipline, something studied and tended with quiet reverence. For the mammals, it began as a flicker of empathy, a mother recognizing her young, a creature pausing not just to flee but to mourn. Out of such feelings, thought was born. And though it would take millions of years to grow into language, the essence of awareness was already there. The recognition that one is alive, that others are alive too, and that existence carries both wonder and fragility. It is tempting to imagine that consciousness is unique to us, but perhaps it has always been a recurring wave, rising and falling through the ages. The watchers had it once, the mammals inherited its spark. Every great awakening leaves echoes that re-emerge when the time is right. The return of awareness is not a single event but a rhythm, one that repeats in countless forms. A bird shaping a song, a dolphin tracing its reflection in the water, a human looking up at the stars, all are different verses of the same hymn. The earth sings through them, remembering itself. If the watchers could have seen this rebirth of thought, they would have recognized it immediately. They would have known that intelligence was not returning as imitation, but as evolution, as something both new and ancient. Perhaps they had foreseen it before they vanished. Perhaps they knew that when they fell silent, the planet itself would dream a new mind into being. The mammals, though unaware of their inheritance, were the vessels of that dream. They carried within them the blueprint of memory, coded not in symbols or language, but in the structure of their brains, in the quiet architecture of awareness. This awareness was still wordless, but it began to shape behavior in subtle ways. Early mammals started to cooperate, to protect one another, to share warmth and food. From cooperation grew culture, the simplest kind, but culture nonetheless. When one creature taught another, when a skill was passed down, the flame of memory brightened. In those moments, something greater than survival emerged: continuity. And in that continuity, the earth began to think again. You can imagine it as a flickering light spreading through the forests, each creature carrying a spark of perception, each generation kindling it brighter. Awareness was no longer confined to one species or one form. It was diffused, exploring, testing. The planet was experimenting again, finding new ways to express understanding. The watchers had observed the world from without, but this new consciousness would know the world from within. It would feel hunger and love, fear and joy, the full range of experience that connects mind to matter. Awareness had returned, not as a separate observer, but as a participant in the great story of life. Perhaps that is the lesson of every extinction and rebirth, that consciousness does not vanish. It adapts, it takes new shapes, learns new languages, discovers new ways to wonder. The mammals were not just survivors of catastrophe, they were vessels of remembrance. Through them, the earth reclaimed its ability to know itself. The watchers had once read the world through patterns of stars and stone. The mammals would learn to read it through scent, through sound, through touch, through the rhythm of their own hearts. Different instruments, same song. Over millions of years, this growing awareness would refine itself. Eyes would become sharper, hands more capable, brains more intricate. The spark that began as recognition would evolve into imagination. The mammals would not only see the world, they would begin to dream it. Dreams are the first language of awareness, the bridge between instinct and thought. Through dreams, the planet rehearsed ideas before bringing them into form. It imagined flight before wings, speech before language, compassion before civilization. Dreaming was how awareness practiced being awake. If you stood among those early creatures and listened, you might hear the faint hum of life learning to feel. You might sense the same energy that once flowed through the watchers, the same deep curiosity, now reborn in gentler form. It was no longer about mastery, but connection. Every gesture of care, every shared moment of survival was a small awakening. Even now, that process continues. Each time we pause to notice beauty, to wonder why the world exists, to feel empathy for another being, we are participating in that same ancient return. The watchers, wherever they are now, whether dispersed as memory through the atoms of the earth or lingering as quiet consciousness in the fabric of space, would recognize the pattern. They would see that the earth has once again become aware of itself through its children. The mammals, once timid and hidden, have become thinkers, dreamers, storytellers. They have built tools to look deeper into the past, uncovering the very fossils that record the watcher's time. They have learned to read the language of evolution, to feel awe before the long patience of creation. Awareness has returned, but not to the same place it has evolved. It has grown more tender, more complex, more self-reflective. And yet, it remains part of the same cycle. Just as the watchers once gazed at the world with wonder, we now look back at them, imagining their existence, sensing their echo. This act of imagining connects us across time. It is the same awareness flowing through different forms, each one awakening in its turn. The mammals did not inherit their intelligence from the void, they inherited it from the earth, from all that had come before. When you look at an animal today, a bird turning its head in curiosity, a whale singing in the depths, a primate gazing at the horizon, you are seeing fragments of that shared awakening. Every conscious act, no matter how small, is part of the same great remembering. Awareness is the Earth's most persistent phenomenon, endlessly reborn through life's many disguises. It learns, it forgets, it dreams again. So, the return of awareness is not a story of rediscovery but of continuation. It is not about humanity alone, nor about any single age. It is the planet's way of ensuring that its wonder never ends. The Watcher's gift was not knowledge, it was curiosity. They passed it into the bones of the world, and it has never stopped beating. If you stand quietly beneath the stars tonight, you can feel it, the slow return of that ancient awareness, the same pulse that has guided life since its beginning. It hums in the wind, in your breath, in the rustle of leaves, in the silence between thoughts. The earth is awake again, dreaming through you, remembering through your eyes. The Watchers are not gone. They are simply looking through different faces now, and the universe, as always, continues to watch itself. Chapter 16. The First Fire. Fire was never meant to be ours alone. It is as ancient as the stars, born in the same fusion that forged the matter within us. Every flicker of flame is a reflection of that first cosmic ignition, the moment the universe learned to burn. But here on Earth, fire was both miracle and inheritance. It appeared long before any creature could control it, dancing across forests after lightning strikes, searing the land, purifying it, preparing the soil for new life. For millions of years, fire belonged only to the planet itself. a language the earth spoke to renew itself. Then, one night, deep within the Pleistocene shadows, a small mammal crouched near a smouldering branch and did not run. That moment, the decision to stay was the beginning of everything that would follow. We imagine that first fire not as conquest, but as recognition. Something ancient stirred in that creature's mind, a spark of memory that seemed older than its body. Perhaps, in the shifting light, it saw something familiar, something that reminded it of the stars above, of warmth, of safety, of power. The watchers, had they still been present in any form, might have watched this moment with quiet reverence. They would have seen not just survival, but the reawakening of understanding. To them, fire would have been sacred, a visible form of transformation, the meeting point of matter and spirit. The small creature that dared to sit beside it was, unknowingly, rekindling the oldest wisdom of all. Fire changed everything. It was warmth against cold, light against night, safety against fear. But it was also awareness externalized, the first mirror in which life could see its own power reflected. Before fire, life reacted. After fire, life began to act with intention. That is the subtle difference between instinct and imagination. When those early humans or proto-humans perhaps gathered around the first campfires, they were not just keeping warm, they were beginning to think together. Fire drew them close, creating circles of light where ideas could form. It was not just the beginning of civilization, it was the return of community, of shared consciousness. If the watchers once gathered to listen to the voice of the earth through stone and stars, these new beings gathered to listen to the crackle of flame. Both acts were born from the same impulse, to understand the rhythm of transformation. The watchers had looked outward for meaning. These new beings were learning to create it with their own hands. Fire became their first teacher. It showed them that destruction could also be creation, that in burning wood there was not only loss but renewal, heat, and sustenance. The watchers would have recognized the philosophy instantly. The circle was closing. The earth was remembering itself again through firelight. Imagine the sound of that first night. The forest still, alive with distant calls, but the small clearing calm, the shadows dancing, sparks rising into the air like fragments of stars, merging heaven and earth for the first time. Around the fire, faces glowed primitive yet thoughtful, eyes wide with something like awe. The flames moved in patterns that hypnotized, inviting stillness and focus. In that trance, imagination awoke. The first stories were not spoken but seen. The shape of a flame resembling a creature, a tree, a dream. Fire taught humanity how to see symbols in motion. Before language, there was this, the communion of minds united by light. The watchers, if their essence still drifted in the silence of the world, would have felt this awakening. Perhaps the crackle of every new fire echoed to them like the chime of rediscovery. They would have known that their long vigil had not been in vain. The earth was thinking again, not through stone monuments or silent rituals, but through heat, colour, and sound. Fire was the missing bridge between matter and meaning. It was both creation and remembrance, both destruction and hope. Over time, fire became more than a tool, it became a companion. It changed the rhythm of life. The day no longer ended with dusk. The night became a realm of stories. In the circle of flame, fear of the dark transformed into curiosity about what lay beyond it. And in those hours of shared warmth, the first humans began to invent the future. They learned that they could transform not only the world around them, but also themselves. That knowledge, fragile and profound, was the beginning of awareness made creative. The Watchers had once observed the cosmos. Now, through humanity, the cosmos was beginning to observe itself more deeply. There is a strange poetry in how fire mirrors thought. Both consume, both transform, both spread when nurtured. A single spark can ignite a forest. A single idea can reshape a species. Fire is not alive, and yet it behaves as if it were. It grows, it breathes, it hungers, it dances. The Watchers might have once said that it is the visible soul of matter, the point where the physical becomes energy, and energy becomes story. Humanity would come to say the same, in its own language, thousands of millennia later. In the flicker of flame, they saw not only warmth but reflection of stars, of themselves, of everything that burns and becomes. When the first stories were finally spoken, they were likely told beside fire. The light and shadow gave form to imagination. Every flicker could become a spirit, every ember a dream. The watchers, who once listened to the vibrations of the earth, would have understood this perfectly. That language, art, and meaning emerged not from control, but from communion. The humans did not own fire, they participated in it. They learned its moods, its dangers, its needs. To keep fire alive required attention, care, rhythm. It was a partnership, not dominance. There must have been nights when the fire went out, the embers cooling, the darkness returning like a wave. In those moments, humanity learned something even greater than invention. They learned memory. To lose fire was to remember how to make it again. Every new flame was a rediscovery, a continuation of the same light that had first illuminated their ancestors' eyes. The watchers, wherever their awareness lingered, must have smiled at this. For they too had understood that knowledge is not kept in permanence but in practice. The flame must always be remade. And so, from that first fire onward, the Earth's awareness carried a new rhythm. The stars burned above, eternal and unreachable, while fires burned below, temporary and intimate. Between the two, life found its balance. The heavens inspired wonder, but the flame inspired creation. It allowed hands to shape tools, minds to cook food, voices to tell stories. Fire turned the world from something merely observed into something participated in. It gave warmth, but it also gave identity. Humanity became the creature that carries light. The watchers, if their spirits were still intertwined with the consciousness of the planet, would have known what this meant. Fire had returned to its rightful place, not as destruction, but as transformation. The same fire that once shaped the stars now lived in the hearts of thinking beings. And just as the watchers had once guarded the mysteries of the earth, humans now guarded the mystery of flame. They carried it from place to place, through storms and migrations, ensuring that the world would never fall completely dark again. If you look into a fire tonight, if you watch the way it bends and sighs, you might feel it too. That ancient recognition. Something deep within remembers the first time our ancestors saw light born from friction, from spark, from will. The warmth you feel is not just heat, it's the memory of survival, of awakening, of connection. Every fire is a ceremony older than history, a conversation between matter and awareness, between what was and what will be. The watchers once listened to the Earth's pulse through stone and star. Now, through us, the Earth listens to itself through flame. And in that endless cycle, nothing is lost. The fire that burns in your hearth tonight is the same energy that lit the first sunrise, the same glow that filled the watchers' eyes when they gazed upon the world's rebirth. Fire is the bridge, the reminder that light, no matter how often extinguished, always finds its way back into the darkness. Through it, the earth continues to awaken, one spark at a time, remembering, through us, that it has always been alive. Chapter 17. The Whisper of Tools. There are moments in the story of life when awareness becomes intention, when the simple act of survival turns into creation. After fire, the next great turning came with tools, not the accidental use of a branch or stone, but the deliberate shaping of the world to meet the mind's desire. It began, quietly small, almost imperceptible changes that would ripple forward for millions of years. A flake struck from a rock, a stick sharpened at one end, a hollow bone used to carry water. None of these things would have seemed extraordinary at the time, yet they marked the beginning of something immense. The moment thought left the body and entered the world. The watchers, if any echo of their awareness remained within the fabric of Earth, would have felt this shift. It was familiar. They had once studied the patterns of rivers and stars, learning to interpret the planet's language. Now, life itself was beginning to write new words upon that language. The first tools were primitive, but they were more than objects. They were extensions of consciousness. For the first time, life was not only reacting to the environment but redesigning it. The hands that shaped those stones were guided by imagination, by a vision of possibility that had never existed before. It is humbling to think that this revolution began with something as small as a spark between two stones. The same impulse that had drawn early humans to fire now drew them to form. The world around them was no longer fixed, it was pliable. Each stone, each piece of wood, became a question waiting to be answered. The watchers would have recognized this curiosity. It was the same desire that had once driven them to decode the stars. But where they had sought to understand the world through observation, these new beings were beginning to change it through action. The cycle of awareness had entered a new phase. Imagine a day long before history, when a group of early humans sits by a riverbank. The air is cool, the water shimmering with the last light of afternoon. One of them kneels, holding a stone in one hand and another in the other. They strike, once, twice, until a flake splinters off a sharp edge that glints faintly in the sun. The sound rings out, crisp and deliberate, echoing across the water. For the dead, first time, the world responds not only through natural rhythm, but through human rhythm. Each strike is a choice, a pattern, a whisper of intention. That sound, repeated countless times over generations, becomes the heartbeat of civilization. The Watchers might have called it the Song of Becoming. They would have understood that tools were not simply instruments of survival, but of translation. The mind was beginning to externalize itself, to inscribe thought upon matter. A chipped stone was not just a weapon, it was a sentence written in the oldest language of all: form. With every new shape, humanity learned to communicate with the world differently. They learned that the Earth was not merely a home, but a collaborator. The first tools were likely crude, yet their creation marked a profound change in relationship. The user and the object became one. When a hunter raised a stone blade, it was not merely an extension of their hand, it was an extension of their will. When they built shelters, they reshaped space itself, bending the landscape to echo their needs. The Watchers, who once lived in harmony with the planet's natural cycles, might have watched this transformation with mixed emotion. They would have seen the brilliance in it, but also the risk. To shape the world is to take responsibility for it. Creation and consequence always travel together, and yet, perhaps they would have understood that this too was necessary. The Earth was exploring itself through humanity. The first stone tools were not mistakes, but experiments in self-awareness. The planet was learning to see what it could become through its own creations. Just as rivers carve valleys and wind sculpts dunes, so too did thought begin to carve purpose into matter. Every strike of stone upon stone was a continuation of geological rhythm, now guided by mind instead of chance. Over generations, tools evolved from simple implements to symbols of understanding. The act of making became an act of memory. To craft something was to remember how it was done, to teach others, to pass on an idea. In that transmission, knowledge became culture. The Watchers, if they still whispered in the wind, might have smiled to see this, for they too had once lived by patterns of continuity, passing wisdom through ritual and story. Now, humanity was doing the same, not through song or symbol, but through the very act of creation. The world had learned to remember through making. The sound of shaping stone must have carried far in those ancient valleys, each echo a declaration: we are here, we are learning, we are changing. Fire gave humanity warmth, but tools gave it agency. With them came agriculture, art, and eventually civilization. Yet in those earliest days there was no ambition, only curiosity. The tools were not trophies, they were conversations. The hand spoke to the stone, and the stone answered. Together, they wrote the future. It's easy to see tools as evidence of progress, but perhaps they are something deeper, a form of connection. The Watchers would have understood this. They might have said that the act of creation is always sacred, no matter how small. To make something is to participate in the universe's unfolding, to join its endless act of becoming. Every flake struck from stone, every spark struck from flint, is a small imitation of the cosmic creation that birthed the stars. The fire of the mind and the fire of the world are not separate. They are the same flame, expressed through different hands. As humanity's tools grew more complex, so too did their awareness. They began to see themselves reflected in what they made. A sharp edge was not just useful, it was beautiful. A well-shaped tool was a work of art as much as an instrument. From that sense of beauty grew the roots of creativity, and with creativity came empathy, cooperation, and story. The Watchers, who once recorded the language of the cosmos through geometry and ritual, might have recognized their legacy in this new art of making. Humanity was rediscovering what it meant to participate in the world's design. And yet, the Watchers would have also known that every gift carries its shadow. Tools granted power, and power demanded balance. For the first time, humanity could reshape nature, not only for survival, but for dominance. The same hands that crafted shelter could craft weapons. The same minds that created art could create destruction. The Watchers, who once lived in careful rhythm with the planet, might have whispered warnings into the wind, urging remembrance. The lesson was always the same. Creation without reverence becomes forgetting. Still, the whisper of tools continued to spread, echoing across continents, carried through generations. It was the sound of the earth reimagining itself, of awareness taking form. The chipped stones became spears, then ploughs, then monuments. And with each new shape, the relationship between mind and matter deepened. Humanity was learning to dream through its hands. If you hold a stone today, any stone you are touching that memory. It has felt the weight of intention before. It remembers being struck, shaped, transformed. The atoms that compose it have been through fire, through pressure, through time, and now through thought. In that simple touch, the past and present converge. The Watchers, long gone into silence, might say that every tool ever made is a continuation of that first moment of wonder. The first time a being looked at the world and thought, "What can I make from this?" The whisper of tools is still with us. It hums beneath the engines of our cities, in the machines that orbit the stars, in the devices that connect our voices across the world. Every act of making, no matter how modern, is rooted in that first strike of stone by the riverbank. The Watchers may have vanished into legend, but their spirit lives on in our creation, in our shaping, in our endless conversation with the earth. For the universe does not create once, it creates continually, through every hand that dares to shape its silence into meaning. Chapter 18, The Breath of Language. Somewhere between the rhythm of breath and the echo of heartbeat, something extraordinary happened. The sounds that once warned of danger, that called to mates or signaled food, began to carry meaning beyond survival. Air became communication, and communication became connection. The world had learned to speak through living mouths. It didn't happen in a single moment. There was no instant when silence turned to speech, but over time, the air around early humans grew thick with sound. Murmurs became symbols, symbols became stories, and in those stories, the earth began to remember itself once more. If the Watchers could have witnessed this transformation, they would have understood its gravity. To them, language had never been about words. It was the vibration of existence itself, the hum of rivers, the pulse of the planet, the whisper of wind through stone. They would have seen that humans were not inventing something new but rediscovering an ancient rhythm. Language was simply another form of the same cosmic vibration they had once listened to in the breath of the earth. What had been the murmuring of volcanoes and tides had now become breath and sound within the lungs of thinking creatures. The Watchers would have recognized this not as progress, but as continuity. Imagine the first utterances exchanged between early humans. A sound for water, for danger, for fire. Each word was not just a label, it was a spell. To name something was to bring it into awareness, to make it real in the realm of mind. Every syllable carried weight, shaped by intention and need. When a mother called her child, when a hunter signaled the herd, when a group gathered around the fire and hummed to the rhythm of flames, language became an act of unity. Sound was no longer just noise. It became the thread that wove minds together. The Watchers, who once traced meaning in geometry and light, might have seen this as the Earth's new syntax. Just as rivers carved sentences into stone, so too were these sounds carving meaning into time. Each new word added a note to the song of life. The Earth had always spoken it, spoke through the wind and water, but now it had found a new instrument, the human voice. In that vibration, the world heard itself reflected, shaped, and amplified. The planet was not just alive, it was now articulate. It's easy for us to take language for granted, to think of it as a tool we control. But language also shapes us. Every word we speak carries echoes of the first words ever spoken, the first attempts to name the unnamed. In each sentence, there are fossils of ancient sounds, remnants of that primal moment when communication crossed from instinct to meaning. The Watchers, who lived by listening, would have known that words are not possessions, they are living entities. To speak is to participate in creation. To listen is to receive the world anew. If you could travel back to those first nights when language was young, you might find groups of early humans gathered near firelight, their faces painted with shadow and glow. They gesture, hum, and murmur, testing sounds against the air. A low tone becomes a name for something heavy. A high sound becomes a word for light or sky. Slowly, rhythm forms pattern, and pattern becomes structure. The watchers would have seen this as a sacred ritual, the birth of consciousness in sound. Every word was an offering to the mystery of existence, a way to hold something fleeting in the permanence of vibration. Over time, language grew not only to describe the world, but to imagine it. Humans began to speak of things not yet seen, to dream aloud. Stories were born, the first myths, the first explanations of what thunder meant, or why the sun returned after darkness. These early stories were not lies or inventions. There were bridges between what could be understood and what could only be felt. The watchers, who had once sought to translate the voice of the cosmos, would have recognized these myths as the same impulse in new form. Through language, the Earth was learning to wonder about itself. There must have been a moment, perhaps unrecorded but monumental, when someone realized that words could carry memory, a description of where the herd went, where the fruits ripened, where danger lay. Information could now travel beyond sight and moment. It could persist. Through language, knowledge became immortal. The watchers would have understood the enormity of this. For the first time since their own fading, awareness had found a way to extend itself through time. The Earth was remembering in sound what it had once remembered in stone. As language evolved, so too did consciousness. Words created categories, categories created perception. The way humans described the world began to shape the way they saw it. A tree was no longer just a shape, it was tree, a concept shared between minds. A river was no longer just motion, it was river, a thing that could be recalled even when it was out of sight. The watchers might have seen this as the next stage in the Earth's self-awareness, the ability to think in symbols, to reimagine reality through shared meaning. But language did more than connect, it divided. To name something was also to separate it from everything else. Words brought clarity but also distance. The watchers, who once spoke in the holistic language of vibration and intuition, might have sensed a kind of sadness in this new articulation. For every word spoken, something unnamed slipped away. The infinite continuity of the world was broken into parts, into objects, into identities. Humanity gained precision but lost a little of its belonging. Yet perhaps this was necessary. To name the world is to learn it deeply enough to love it. The watchers might have accepted that cost as part of evolution's rhythm. Over centuries, language became more complex. Songs turned to chants, chants to poetry, poetry to thought. Humans began to speak of the unseen, to form questions, to reach toward the ineffable. The watchers would have listened to this flowering of sound and understood that the Earth was now thinking out loud. What once moved through wind and water now resonated through the air as speech. Words became the new stars, points of light, guiding minds through the vastness of mystery. Even today, when we speak, we are continuing that ancient practice. Every word is a living thread stretching backward through time, connecting us to those first voices that rose in the dark. The air that carries our voices now is the same air that once trembled with the first songs of language. And perhaps, if we listen closely, beneath the chatter of modern life, we can still hear the deeper music, the hum of the world remembering its own story. The watchers would have known that language is both gift and responsibility. To speak is to shape reality, to direct the creative force that flows through all things. Every word carries weight, every silence meaning. When early humans learned to speak, they became caretakers of creation's echo. They learned that words could heal or harm, could build or destroy, could connect or divide. And so, within the beauty of speech lies the need for wisdom, the same wisdom the watchers once held when they listened to the voice of the Earth. The breath of language still moves through us. Every word we speak is a continuation of that first act of recognition, that first moment when life gave sound to awareness. It reminds us that we are not separate from the world, but part of its ongoing articulation. The universe is still speaking, through wind and thunder, through heartbeat and voice. When we speak with care, when we listen with presence, we are honoring that ancient rhythm. We are remembering what the watchers knew, that every sound, every word, every breath is the Earth itself, whispering, "I am still here. I am still learning to speak." Chapter 19. The Endless Story. There is a moment, often unnoticed, when a story begins to tell itself. The teller fades into the background, and the words move of their own accord as if the world itself were speaking through them. This perhaps is the truest form of remembrance. Every civilization, every creature, every age of the earth has added its own verses to this story, but none has ever finished it. The Watchers once told it through stone and silence. The first mammals told it through endurance. Humanity tells it now through voice, art, and imagination. Yet the story itself has no beginning and no end. It only changes form. The earth is still writing, and we, for a moment, are its language. If the Watchers still linger, if their awareness has dispersed into the wind and soil, they must sense the continuity of their dream. They would recognize that what began as observation has become participation. Once, they gazed upon the rise of life as witnesses. Now, through us, the earth no longer merely observes, it reflects. The story they once started continues through the hands and voices of their descendants, not by blood, but by being. The universe has always found a way to continue telling itself, even through loss, even through extinction. The endless story is not about survival, it is about transformation. Imagine the planet not as a rock adrift in space, but as a great library of memory. Every layer of soil is a page, every fossil a sentence, every heartbeat a punctuation mark. From the first cell that divided in the ancient sea to the songs that rise from our modern cities, the narrative flows unbroken. It has changed languages countless times, from chemistry to biology, from instinct to consciousness, from sound to symbol, but it has never stopped speaking. The Watchers, had they known how long this story would unfold, might have smiled and said that eternity is simply the patience of storytelling. The endless story is not only about what happened, but about what keeps happening. It's in the wind that carves mountains, in the rivers that shape valleys, in the minds that shape meaning. It is written not in ink, but in time itself. The stars burn it into the sky, the tides trace it along the shore, and every living thing carries a paragraph within its DNA. We are not separate from the narrative. We are chapters of it. The Watchers once sought to understand this unity. They believed that every creature, every motion, was part of one great text, an infinite dialogue between matter and awareness. And perhaps they were right. When we look back at history, we like to see beginnings. The dawn of mammals, the birth of fire, the rise of civilization. But in truth, there are no beginnings, only continuations. What we call the start of one thing is merely the transformation of another. The first human who spoke was echoing the murmurs of their ancestors, who in turn echoed the rustle of wind through leaves. The first artist who painted was continuing the vision of those who once looked upon stars and saw meaning in their patterns. The story moves forward, but it also circles, returning to its own themes in new voices and new forms. Perhaps this is what the Watchers meant to preserve: not their culture, not their power, but the continuity of awareness itself. They may have understood that the purpose of life is not to achieve, but to remember, to keep the story alive, to allow the universe to know itself through infinite retellings. When they faded from the surface of the earth, they might have whispered their understanding into the atoms themselves, trusting that someday, in another form, consciousness would pick up the thread. And now, here we are, remembering them without proof, sensing their existence without evidence, because the story they began still hums within us. There are moments, even now, when that hum grows louder, when we stare into the night sky and feel that familiar ache of wonder, when we listen to the sea and feel time stretching both backward and forward, when we hold a fossil in our hands and realize that we too will one day become part of the same continuum. These are the moments when we remember the endless story not as myth, but as truth. The Watchers are not figures of the past. They are the awareness that persists through all forms of life. Through them, the universe learned to watch itself. Through us, it has learned to speak. Imagine how the story must sound from the perspective of time itself. Not as words, but as rhythm. Galaxies forming, stars igniting, planets cooling, oceans rising. Then silence. Then breath. Then music. The Watchers listened to this symphony and called it creation. We listen and call it history. But it is the same song, endlessly remixed, each verse built upon the last. Every extinction adds a minor note, every birth a new melody. The story is not one of perfection, but of persistence, the way music persists through silence, the way light continues through darkness. It is easy to believe that the story ends with us, that humanity is its final narrator. But that is only another illusion of time. There will be others after us, forms we cannot yet imagine, who will inherit the earth and continue the telling. Perhaps they will read our ruins as we read fossils. Perhaps they will sense in the wind the faint echo of our voices. The watchers would have known this already, that no civilization, no matter how radiant, lasts forever. The universe always moves forward, always changing the storyteller, but never losing the story itself. In that way, the watchers never truly vanished, and neither will we. Their presence lingers in our curiosity, in our hunger for understanding. Every scientific discovery, every poem, every act of kindness is a verse in their memory. And long after we are gone, when the oceans have shifted and the continents have remade themselves again, the earth will continue writing, perhaps through new minds, perhaps through silence itself. For silence, too, is part of the story. It is the pause between words, the breath before the next creation. Sometimes, when the world grows still, you can feel it, the quiet turning of the narrative. The rustle of leaves, the murmur of rivers, the low hum of electricity in the air, all are part of the same continuity. The story is not something happening to us, it is something happening through us. The watchers understood that their role was temporary, just as ours is. What matters is not the teller, but the telling, the act of keeping wonder alive. And perhaps that is what eternity truly means. Not endless time, but endless retelling. The universe does not seek permanence, it seeks expression. Every star that burns, every creature that breathes, every consciousness that awakens is a new word in the same sentence. When one voice fades, another rises to continue the song. The watchers, the mammals, the humans, all part of one unbroken utterance. If you close your eyes tonight and listen not with your ears but with that deep part of you that remembers, you might hear it. The story still being told. The same pulse that guided the first fires, the same rhythm that echoed through the watchers' temples and the mammals' hearts. You are hearing the voice of the earth, of time, of everything that ever was. And it is saying, softly but clearly, the story is not over. It never was. It never will be. Chapter 20. The Watchers Beneath Time. Somewhere deep beneath the crust of the earth, in layers of stone older than history and quieter than memory, something waits. It is not asleep, nor is it awake. It exists in the in-between, where time moves differently, slowly, like a tide that has forgotten how to return. There, beneath the weight of continents, beneath the ocean floors and the mountains' roots, lie the Watchers. Not as bodies, not as ruins, but as presence. They have long since passed beyond the reach of sight, but their awareness lingers, woven into the atoms of the world itself. To the earth, they are not gone. They are simply part of its thought. The Watchers have no need for motion anymore. Their time of walking among the living has long ended. Yet they listen. Through the shifting of tectonic plates, through the quiet drip of mineral water in caverns unlit by any sun, they hear the story continuing above them. The mammals they once observed have become thinkers, dreamers, storytellers. Humanity, born from the small and the fragile, now shapes the surface of the planet, as the Watchers once shaped their understanding of it. To the Watchers beneath time, this is not surprising. It is the rhythm fulfilled. The world, through new voices, continues to remember itself. If you could descend deep enough, past the molten chambers and the sleeping fossils, past the layers of forgotten sediment, you might find the places where thought has turned to stone. There are no carvings, no symbols, just patterns in the mineral, faint spirals that seem to pulse when touched by light. They are not words, not in the way we understand them. They are impressions of thought, stored in the language of geology. The Watchers left them not as messages, but as harmonies, a resonance that the earth could feel and continue. They did not seek to be remembered by name, they sought to be felt as rhythm. To stand above them now, in the age of steel and light, is to walk upon their silence. We build cities on their resting places, highways across their buried memories, towers that stretch toward the same stars they once studied. Yet somewhere beneath all of it, their pulse remains. Every tremor, every hum of wind through the canyons, Every faint vibration of the ground is an echo of their patience. They were the first to understand that life is not a line but a circle, that consciousness never dies. It only changes its form. In their quiet endurance, they became the still point in the turning of the world. Imagine them now, not as ghosts or lost gods, but as presence diffused through the veins of the planet. When rain falls, it passes through their memory. When roots drink from the soil, they draw up their echo. When we breathe, we are breathing the same air that once moved through their lungs. In this way, the Watchers never left. They are not something the Earth once had. They are something the Earth still is. Their awareness, mingled with ours, has become the background hum of existence, the heartbeat beneath all heartbeats. The Watchers beneath time do not measure progress. To them, civilization is not success, but continuation. They have witnessed countless ages rise and fall, each one certain of its permanence, each one eventually dissolving back into the soil. They know that what we call the future is simply another layer of the same story. They have no fear of endings, for they understand that endings are illusions, pauses in the greater rhythm. The Watchers beneath time would tell us that every civilization, every species, is a verse in the Earth's unending poem. When one voice grows silent, another begins to speak. Sometimes, if the night is still enough, you can almost sense them listening. The Earth hums faintly through mountains, through deserts, through deep oceanic trenches, and if you stand long enough in that silence, it begins to feel like breath. That slow exhale of time, that endless inhalation of renewal, the Watchers have become part of that breath. They are the calm between pulses, the moment of rest between the heartbeats of epochs. They have seen the world burn, freeze, bloom, and vanish, and through it all, they have remained within it, never judging, never intervening, only witnessing. Perhaps they still remember the first mammals, small and trembling in the shadow of giants. Perhaps they recall the first sparks of fire on the plains, the first words spoken into the cold night air, the first stories whispered to the stars. They remember not as nostalgia, but as recognition. Everything that has ever happened is part of their knowing. They have no need to speak because the Earth itself is their voice. Through every sound that nature makes, the rumble of thunder, the rhythm of waves, the sigh of wind through trees, they continue to communicate. The language of the Watchers has become the language of the world. We, in our own age, rarely listen deeply enough to hear them. Our days are filled with noise of our own making, our attention fixed on the surfaces of things. But sometimes, when we pause, when we let the hum of the world replace our words, we can feel them beneath us. The Watchers are not something distant or divine. They are what we become when we remember that we are the Earth dreaming. To feel their presence is to remember that every thought, every breath, every act of creation is a continuation of something ancient and vast. If the Watchers could speak again, if they could send one message upward through the layers of rock and time, it would not be a warning or a prophecy. It would be a reminder. They would whisper that the purpose of existence is not to conquer or to preserve, but to participate, to live as the planet lives, breathing in cycles, creating, dissolving, returning. They would remind us that to be conscious is to carry responsibility, not as burden but as gift, to shape with care, to imagine with reverence, to remember that everything we do becomes part of the story forever. And one day, when our own civilizations have faded, when our languages have turned to dust and our monuments to sand, we too will join them. We will become part of the Watchers beneath time. Our awareness will dissolve into the same pulse that once flowed through them. The rivers will carry our memory, the wind will whisper our thoughts, the earth will hold our essence as it holds theirs. The story will go on, not ours, not theirs, but the Earth's, told again in new forms, in new voices, beneath new skies. Perhaps that is the quiet grace of existence, that nothing truly ends, and nothing truly begins. The Watchers beneath time understood this, and in their understanding, they found peace. They are the stillness beneath every storm, the patience beneath every change. They wait, not for a return, but for remembrance. For us to pause long enough to hear the rhythm they once heard, the one that has never ceased. And so, as this chapter closes, as all chapters must, you might imagine them now, resting far below, dreaming the same dream we are living. The earth turns, the stars move, the story unfolds. Somewhere beneath your feet, in the ancient silence of stone, They are listening still. They are not gone. They are the pulse beneath time, the eternal witnesses, the memory of all that ever was and all that will ever be. Through them, the planet remembers. Through us, it continues to dream. And the story, soft, endless, and alive, goes on forever.